The room is small. That is the first thing to notice. A man who spent 50 years writing about the search for the self chose a room you could cross in 10 steps. Montagnola, a hill town above Lake Lugano in the Swiss canton of Ticino. The year is 1946. Hermann Hesse is 69 years old. 3 months ago, a telegram arrived from Stockholm informing him that the Nobel Prize in Literature was his. He did not go to collect it. He was not well enough, he said. That was true. But there was something else. He had never been comfortable receiving. Tonight, he is at his desk. The lamp throws its amber circle across the page. Outside, the lake is a darkness below the hill. The olive trees are still. The pen moves. He has been asking the same question since he was 13 years old, when he ran away from a seminary in southern Germany and stood in a field in the rain, not knowing what he had run toward. That question has taken the shape of novels, watercolors, letters, 3 marriages, 1 full breakdown, 40 years on this hillside. It has never fully resolved. You are in the dark now. Your room has gone quiet. The day has done what it came to do. Let your body settle where it is. Tonight we sit with a man who searched his entire life and found in the end that the searching itself was the answer he had been looking for, not the arrival, the searching. This will take some time to understand. Hesse himself took a lifetime. Let your shoulders drop. The lamp is on. We begin. He was born in 1877 inches Col, a small market town in the Black Forest, on the banks of the Nagold River. The river moved through the center of the town the way a thought moves through a quiet mind, slowly, with purpose, in no hurry to be somewhere else. As a boy, Hesse walked beside it in the evenings, watching the water change color with the sky. He did not know yet what it was teaching him. That understanding would come much later, through a character named Siddhartha and a ferryman named Vasudeva, both of whom lived only in his pages. But we are not there yet. His grandfather was Hermann Gundert, a remarkable man, a missionary who had spent decades in India, who had mastered Malayalam, who had compiled dictionaries and translated whole libraries, who had returned from the subcontinent with something in his eyes that made other missionaries uneasy. He had seen too many faces of the same truth. His faith had grown large enough to contain its own doubt. Hesse's parents continued the mission work. His father, Johannes, was precise, well-ordered, devout. His mother, Marie, was literary and prone to long silences that young Hermann recognized in himself the way a child recognizes a fever, as something familiar but not chosen. Both parents wrote. Both parents expected their son to serve something larger than himself. The problem was that Hesse could not decide what that larger thing was. Let the weight of your body rest fully where you lie. The question he could not answer is a question most people carry quietly. What am I for? Not in a despairing sense, as a genuine investigation. The families that raised us came with an answer ready. The schools had one. The careers, the schedules, the titles on business cards, these are all answers handed to us before we were old enough to ask whether we agreed with the question. Hesse never agreed. Not rudely, he simply could not make the answer fit. At the desk in Montagnola, the pen is still moving. He is writing to a young reader who has asked him, "What is the purpose of all this searching? Why does none of it resolve?" He pauses. He looks out the window at the dark lake. He writes, "The search does not end, but the searcher changes. Eventually, the one who is searching becomes interesting enough that the search no longer matters." He is not entirely satisfied with that answer. He was rarely satisfied with any of his answers. This is the thing about Hesse that made him one of the most widely read writers of the 20th century, and also one of the loneliest. He refused the comfort of arriving. The lamp is on. In Montagnola, a man is still at his desk. The lake is below. We will follow the thread of his long life tonight, from the Black Forest to this hillside, from the seminary wall he climbed over at 13 to the last watercolor he painted at 85. Feel the breath moving through you. You do not need to change it. The night is quiet. We continue. Chapter 2. A boy and a strange town. There is a particular kind of child who is homesick everywhere. Not unhappy, necessarily, not unkind, simply unable to arrive. Hesse was that child. Chor was a beautiful town by any measure. The river, the medieval bridge, the surrounding hills, the smell of wood smoke in autumn. And Hesse spent his childhood feeling that he did not quite belong to it. This is not as dramatic as it sounds. It rarely is in the early years. There is no crisis, only a low, persistent awareness. Something elsewhere is calling. The child cannot name it, cannot find it on a map. He can only feel its pull when he is reading or walking alone or watching the river. Rainer Maria Rilke, who was born 2 years after Hesse and would spend his life writing letters to people who felt this way, described it simply: the feeling that you are always in a room that is slightly wrong. Not a bad room, a room that belongs to someone else. Rilke spent his life in the houses of patrons, moving from castle to castle across Europe, writing his poems in borrowed spaces. He understood the condition. Hesse understood it from childhood, and he understood it as a form of loneliness that could not be cured by company. He was not lonely for other people. He was lonely for a version of himself that he had not yet met. His grandfather's library was the first place he felt close to that version. The books from India, the Vedas, the Upanishads, works his grandfather had translated, with the careful love of a man who knew that translation was interpretation. That interpretation was a form of prayer. Young Hermann sat in that room and read things that his parents' German Protestant Christianity had not prepared him to understand, and understood them anyway. The self is not the body. The self is not the name. The self is something that watches the body and the name, something older and quieter, something that was not born when you were born and will not die when you die. He was 11 when he first encountered this idea in his grandfather's library. He would spend the next 70 years trying to confirm it through his own experience. His mother worried. She loved her son, and she could see, with the kind of precise sadness that mothers develop, that he was already somewhere she could not follow. She wrote in her diary, "Hermann is strange and wonderful, and I do not know what will become of him." His father responded to strangeness with structure, more Latin, more scripture, more hours at the desk. Johannes Hesse was not a cruel man. He was a thorough one, and he believed that discipline was love given useful form. Hesse experienced it differently. Let your jaw soften. You do not need to hold anything right now. The tension between the father and the son was not unique to this family. It is a tension that runs through a great deal of philosophy and psychology. The conflict between the life handed to you and the life you can feel waiting inside you. Carl Jung would later call this the individuation process, the long, often painful work of becoming who you actually are rather than who you were shaped to be. But Jung had not yet written that. It was the 1880s. Hesse was a boy in the Black Forest, sitting beside a river, watching the water move. Friedrich Nietzsche, whose books would find their way into Hesse's hands in his teenage years, wrote that the value of a person lay in their willingness to become what they uniquely were, not to follow the herd, not to inherit the values of the crowd, but to carve out of themselves, through suffering and will, a genuine individual. This appealed enormously to young Hesse and would cause him significant problems later when he discovered that willing yourself into individuality and listening your way into it were entirely different practices. But the problem had not yet been identified. In Carl, in the 1880s, there was only the river and the library and the persistent low feeling. Something is waiting somewhere, and it is not here. He was 8 when he told his mother that he wanted to be a poet. She wrote in her diary that night, "God help him." She meant it tenderly. Notice your breath. The air is still. The room is settling around you as the night deepens. In Carl, the Nagold River ran on without stopping, as rivers do. It had no destination in mind. It simply moved. The boy beside it would spend his whole life trying to understand what that meant. Chapter 3. The First Escape. In 1891, Hermann Hesse was 14 years old, and he ran away. The Evangelical Theological Seminary at Maulbronn was a medieval monastery converted into a school for boys who were being prepared for the ministry. High stone walls, Gothic vaulting, Latin before breakfast, prayers at evening. The halls smelled of cold stone and expectation. Hesse had won a state scholarship to attend. It was an honor. His parents were relieved. The boy's strangeness might yet be channeled into service. The ministry was a dignified life. Important, needed. He lasted 7 months. On a March evening in 1892, Hesse slipped away from the seminary grounds. He spent a night in a forest. When the search party found him the next morning, he was sitting under a tree, reportedly calm, refusing to explain where he had been trying to go. He did not know where he had been trying to go. That was the honest answer, and it was too strange to say out loud. He had been trying to go toward the thing that he could feel pulling at him, the unnamed destination, the life that felt like it was actually his. He had simply climbed over the wall in its direction. He was returned to the seminary. He did not stay long. By May, the school sent him home. He was disruptive, they said. Depressed, certainly. Possibly dangerous. His parents tried a different institution, an institution for children with nervous dispositions. Then a local school, then an apprenticeship with a clockmaker in Cowell. None of these held him either. In 1892, having been expelled or withdrawn from 3 educational settings in 1 year, Hesse attempted to end his life. He was 15. There is something Hesse discovered in the middle of all of this, the running, the returns, the darkness, that he never fully explained in his letters. He spoke around it in his fiction, circled it in his essays, approached it in the novels without quite naming it. We will find that thing tonight. It is not where you might expect. Let your shoulders drop. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. He survived. He recovered in the way that a person recovers from a crisis, not by having the crisis resolved, but by becoming someone who is slightly different on the other side of it. The boy who came back was quieter. He read more. He had discovered something about the bottom of things, that it held. His father, Johannes, wrote in a letter to a colleague, "I do not know what to do with this boy. He is suffering something I do not have the right words for." Arthur Schopenhauer, whose work Hesse would encounter a few years later in a second-hand bookshop, had written that the root of human suffering was the will, the endless, insatiable drive to become, to possess, to persist. Suffering did not come from misfortune alone. It came from the fundamental nature of consciousness, which wanted things it could not have and could not stop wanting. The only way through was to recognize the wanting itself, to see it, to cease feeding it, to find a kind of peace in the stillness that lay beneath the drive. 15-year-old Hesse had not read Schopenhauer yet, but he had felt the thing Schopenhauer described, the 3 chairs. In Walden, which Hesse would also read later, years later, with deep recognition, Henry David Thoreau described a cabin in the Massachusetts woods and 3 chairs, 1 for solitude, 2 for friendship, 3 for society. The chairs suggest that a person needs to know which one they are in. Hesse's problem in his early years was that he had been placed in the 3rd chair by everyone around him: society's chair, the minister's chair, the scholarship boy's chair, when everything in him wanted the first. He did not yet have the words for this. He had only the wall of the seminary, and the night, and the forest, and the question, where am I going? Let the weight of the bed receive you fully. There is nowhere to go right now. The night is doing what it came to do. He was 15. He would ask the same question for the next 70 years, and the asking, in the end, would be the answer. Chapter 4, The Glass in the Workshop. The clockmaker's workshop smelled of oil and metal shavings. Hesse was 16 when he started work there. His father had decided that a practical trade might steady the boy where the seminary had failed. The logic was sound, the logic was wrong. He spent 18 months in Cowell learning to repair clocks. He was not particularly good at it. His hands were careful enough, but his mind was somewhere else during the hours with the mechanism. He was reading. Before work, at lunch, after. In the evenings he read until he could not keep his eyes open. Then he slept and dreamed and woke and read again. The bookshops of Cowell were not extensive. but they were enough. He worked through them. Goethe, who had spent his life writing about the conflict between the artist's inner world and the demands of the outer one. Schiller, who believed that art was freedom given form. The Romantics, Novalis, Hölderlin, who had understood that the search for the infinite was also a search for the self, and that neither search could be abandoned without a kind of death. And then, in a second-hand shop in 1893, he found Schopenhauer, The World as Will and Representation. A young man who feels that consciousness itself is the wound reads the philosopher who says, "You are correct, it is." But here is what you can do with that knowledge. Schopenhauer's answer was art, music especially. In aesthetic experience, Schopenhauer argued the will briefly releases its grip. For a moment, listening to music, looking at a painting, reading a great poem, the striving stops. The wanting goes quiet. Something underneath rises to the surface. He called it pure knowing, the experience of the world without the self's agenda filtering it. Hesse read this in the back room of a clock workshop in the Black Forest and felt recognized. Let your jaw soften. Let the thought you are carrying rest somewhere else for a moment. He began to write poems. This is the standard progression. A young person who is overwhelmed by the inner life finds language as a container for it. Hesse's early poems were not very good. He knew they were not very good. He wrote them anyway, because not writing them was worse. The clockmaker did not object to the writing. He was a practical man who had taken on this unusual boy as a favor to the Hesse family, and who had noticed, without particular alarm, that the boy seemed to live in two places at once. The workshop, where his hands were, and somewhere else entirely, where his attention was. In 1895, Hesse left the workshop and took a position in a bookshop in Tübingen, then another in Basel. He was 18, then 19, selling books during the day and reading everything he could not sell in the evenings. This was, it turned out, the education he had been looking for. Not Latin before breakfast in a stone hall. This. Books, shelves, hours, the smell of printed pages. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust hung over Hesse's early years the way a great ceiling fresco hangs over a small room. You cannot look anywhere without it being there at the edge of your vision. Faust, who had studied everything and still felt he knew nothing. Faust, who made his bargain with the devil not out of greed, but out of desperation. I want to feel something. I want to experience something that all my reading has not given me. I want the thing behind the thing. Hesse understood Faust. He would spend much of his fiction writing his own versions of that bargain. Characters who have tried every intellectual framework and still lie awake, still wanting, still searching for the unnamed thing. Feel the bed under you. The weight of you is held. You do not need to do anything. In the bookshop in Basel, a young man with fine hands and wire-rimmed spectacles moved between the shelves with the ease of someone who has finally found the right room. He was still searching. He would always be searching. But here, at least, the searching had a shape. He was reading Dostoevsky, who had spent his life writing about the distance between who a person thought they were and who they actually were. He was reading William James, whose Principles of Psychology had just been published. The idea that consciousness was not a series of separate thoughts, but a stream, a continuous flow, a river rather than a chain of beads. He was reading Marcus Aurelius, who had written at night in a tent on the Danube frontier, asking himself the same questions Hesse was asking. What is the actual self? What, underneath the performance, is actually here? The answers were different depending on who you asked, but all of them agreed on one thing: you could not find out without looking. Chapter 5: What the Fathers Wanted. There is a weight that the children of deeply religious families carry into the world. It is not always the faith itself. Sometimes the faith is exactly right for the child, and they carry it lightly and gratefully. But sometimes the faith is the right container for the parent's life and the wrong container for the child's, and then the weight is different. It is the weight of wanting to honor what you were given, while also knowing, quietly and without drama, that it does not fit. Hesse's grandfather, Hermann Hesse, was one of the most remarkable people in his bloodline, a scholar, a linguist, a man of genuine spiritual depth who had spent decades living among people whose traditions were entirely different from his own, and had emerged from that experience not more certain, but more curious. His faith had been worn into something smoother and more honest by its encounters with other faiths. Govinda had seen the Vedanta from the inside. He had read the Upanishads not as a curious outsider, but as a translator, and translation means entering. The idea that Brahman, the universal consciousness, was not separate from Atman, the individual self, that the searching was already the thing searched for, that the river and the river watcher were one, this was not foreign to him. He had held it in his hands. What he did with it in relation to his own Protestant Christianity was complicated. He was a serious thinker. He kept the complication alive rather than resolving it cheaply. His grandson inherited the complication. Hesse's father, Johannes, was a simpler man in the best sense. He believed what he had been taught, and he practiced it with care and consistency. He wanted his son to do the same. He was not a tyrant. He was a worried father who could see that his boy was suffering and who had only one prescription: more faith, more structure, more God. The prescription did not take. Let your body be heavy. Let everything you are carrying rest where it is. What Hesse understood by the time he was 20, working in the Basel bookshop, was that the searching itself was a form of faith. Not faith in a particular account of reality. Faith in the reality of the inner life as a place that could be known. Faith in the proposition that the question of who you actually are was worth the whole of a life's attention. He had read enough Nietzsche by then to know that this kind of faith required courage. Nietzsche, who had been born into a pastor's family, who had studied theology before turning to philology and philosophy, who had declared that God was dead, not triumphantly, as people sometimes misread him, but with the horror of someone who had looked at what that meant, Nietzsche knew what it cost to reject the inherited framework. You were left in a world without external meaning, with only the self's capacity to create it. Hesse was not convinced that meaning had to be created. He suspected it was already there, waiting to be found. This was where he and Nietzsche diverged, and where his grandfather's India began to be more useful than his father's Germany. Pascal had written from a small room in 17th century France. All of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly alone in a room. Hesse read this and laughed. He had been trying to sit quietly alone in a room his whole life. The problem was not the inability to sit. The problem was the noise that sitting made audible. At 20, in Basel, he wrote to his father, "I cannot be what you hoped I would be, but I think I am becoming something that will make sense eventually. Please be patient." His father wrote back, "I am praying for you." He meant it. Both of them knew how to be kind. The distance between them was not cruelty. It was simply the width between one life and another. Notice your breathing. The room is quiet. The air is soft. He published his first book in 1899, a collection of poems called Romantic Songs. It sold almost nothing. He was not discouraged. He was 22, working in a bookshop, writing in the evenings, convinced, not arrogantly but quietly, that he was moving in the right direction. His father died in 1916, before Hesse found what he was looking for. Or perhaps by then the direction had been clear enough that the father had some peace about it. We do not know. Families hold things that never make it into letters. The river ran on in Karl. The boy had become a man. The question had not changed. Chapter 6. The Burned Pages. In 1904, Hesse published Peter Kamenzind. It was his first novel. It sold immediately. The literary world of German-speaking Europe took notice. Here was a new voice, young, melancholic, precise, in love with nature, in a way that owed something to romanticism but had moved past it. The book told the story of a young man from a mountain village who goes out into the world, cannot find what he is looking for, and returns to the village changed. It was, like everything Hesse would write, a story about the search. He became famous. Within the German literary world, he became one of the most prominent writers of his generation. Thomas Mann, who was working on his own large books at the same time, wrote Hesse a letter of genuine admiration. And Hesse was miserable. Not dramatically, not in a way that showed. He married Maria Bernoulli in 1904, the year of Peter Kamenzind, and they moved to a house in the country near Geienhofen on Lake Constance. And he grew a garden and wrote and was, by any external measure, living well. The inner life told a different story. He wrote in letters from this period about feeling split. There was the Hermann Hesse who had published the novel and received the letters and answered the invitations and was grateful and professional and organized. And there was the other one, the one who had stood in a field at 14 in the rain, not knowing where he was going, and that one was still there, still searching, still unanswered. He began to write and destroy, not in despair, in necessity. He would write dozens of pages, read them, decide that he was performing rather than discovering, and burn them, not in anger, with something more like precision. There is a night he wrote about obliquely in several essays, the night he burned a large portion of what would have been a novel. He did not describe the grief of it, because there was not much grief. He described a feeling of clarity, the burning of bad pages, pages that were pretending to be something they were not, felt, he wrote, like the clearing of a field. You could see what the soil actually was. Tonight we will arrive at what that burning taught him. It is not what you might expect from a literary story about destruction. We are not there yet. The teaching comes through the fire, not before it. Let the pillow hold the back of your head fully. Let your neck soften. He was reading voraciously during these years. He had always read voraciously. But what he was reading changed in his 30s. He moved away from the European philosophical tradition toward the East. Not as an escape, he was suspicious of spiritual tourism, suspicious of people who adopted Eastern frameworks as a way of avoiding their own Western problems. He moved toward the East because his grandfather's India had always been there in the family's blood, a suggestion waiting to be taken seriously. The Bhagavad Gita, the Tao Te Ching, which he already knew but read differently now, the Buddhist sutras. The concept, which appears in different forms across all these traditions, that the self one is trying to find is not the constructed self, the one assembled from education and approval and ambition, but the one that is already there underneath, which has never needed to search because it has never been lost. This idea did not feel foreign to Hesse. It felt like the thing he had been circling for 20 years without having found the exact words for it. Lao Tzu had written in the Tao Te Ching that the sage does not compete, and because he does not compete, nobody can compete with him. The water does not fight the stone. The water simply goes around. Eventually, the water is still there. The stone is not. Hesse read this beside Lake Constance in the early 1900s and thought about his father's prescription: more faith, more structure, more effort, and about the pages he had burned. There was a connection there that he was not yet able to articulate. He would spend the next decade finding it. The river in Cowell was still flowing. The water did not fight the stone. Feel the weight of the night around you. The thinking can rest. The night will hold it. Chapter 7. To Two Voices in One House. Maria Bernoulli was 9 years older than Hesse. She was a photographer, practical, reserved, with a dry precision to her speech that Hesse found both steadying and eventually impossible. She believed in quiet. She believed in craft. She was not temperamentally suited to living with a man who was perpetually in the middle of becoming someone new. They had 3 sons: Bruno, Heiner, Martin. Hesse loved them with the kind of love that is not quite enough, the love of a man who is too deep in his own interior life to be fully present in someone else's. He described himself in letters from this period as a man with 2 selves: one who lived in the house on the lake, who grew vegetables and mended fences and attended to the children, and one who lived somewhere behind the eyes, watching the other, never quite convinced that the daily life was the real one. Carl Jung, who had published his early work on the unconscious by this point, would have recognized this description immediately. The Jungian framework, the idea that consciousness had multiple layers, that the ego was only the surface of the self, that beneath it moved an autonomous inner life that was sometimes at odds with the life one was living, was becoming available in the German-speaking intellectual world just as Hesse was discovering he needed it. Hesse did not seek analysis until much later, but he was reading Jung's published papers in the years before the breakdown, recognizing himself in the clinical language the way a person sometimes recognizes their own face in a description they were not expecting. Two voices in one house, one that managed the day, one that would not be managed. Let your breath slow, let your eyes rest wherever they have settled. Thomas Mann, who was a friend of Hesse's from this period, was a man of perfect exterior order, organized, socially skilled, deeply controlled, a genius at managing the presentation of himself to the world. Hesse admired this in Mann and could not have done it himself. They were complementary figures. Mann moved through the literary world with the ease of a man who had made his peace with appearances. Hesse moved through it with the uneasy shuffle of someone who kept feeling that the appearances were a form of lying. They wrote letters to each other for decades. In one letter, Hesse told Mann, "I do not know how you do it. The social life, the dinners, the public face. I come home from readings exhausted in a way I cannot explain to Maria. Something is borrowed out of me." Mann wrote back, "I do not do it as well as you think. The order on the outside is related to the disorder it is holding in." They understood each other. They were different enough that understanding was useful. In Geienhofen, the house was mostly quiet. Hesse wrote in the mornings. Maria managed the household. The boys grew. The garden produced its vegetables. And underneath the quietness, Hesse heard the other voice, the one that had stood in the field at 14, still asking, still unresolved. The first marriage was not a failure of affection. It was a failure of fit. Two people who were not wrong for each other and yet were wrong for each other. This is one of the saddest categories of human experience and one of the most common. Feel the warmth of the blanket. The night is doing its work. He was writing during these years, Beneath the Wheel, 1906, Gertrude, 1910, Roshalde, 1914. Books about men who cannot live their lives, and the women and children who are required to absorb the cost of that inability. He knew what he was writing. He was not unconscious of the parallels. He wrote them anyway. They were the most honest thing he could do. Dostoevsky wrote about similar men, underground men, men who knew too much about themselves to be comfortable and not enough to be free. Hesse read Dostoevsky with the recognition of a man finding his own symptoms in a medical text. The brothers Karamazov, The Idiot. Notes from Underground. The same question running through all of them. What does the honest person do with the distance between who they are and who they appear to be? The answer Dostoevsky proposed was suffering. You hold the gap open and you suffer it, and something holy grows in the suffering if you do not flinch. Hesse proposed something quieter, but he had not found it yet. In the house on the lake, with the two voices, he was still in the suffering part. The lake was dark in the evenings. The water did not fight anything. It simply held the light that came to it. Chapter 8, The River He Had Not Yet Seen. In 1911, Hermann Hesse went to India. He went as a writer, not as a spiritual pilgrim. He was commissioned to write about the journey. He kept his notebook. He observed. He travelled with a friend through Ceylon and Sumatra and parts of Southeast Asia, and what he discovered at the end of 3 months was that the India of his grandfather's letters and the actual India he was moving through were entirely different places, and that neither was quite the India he had been carrying inside himself since childhood. He came back with a strange feeling that the journey he had needed to take was inward, and that he had gone east in the wrong direction. He wrote about the trip without pretending he had found what he had been looking for. This honesty was characteristic. He was not a man who performed discovery. If something had not been found, he said it had not been found. The account of the India journey, later published as Out of India, is the work of a man who has cleared away a specific mistake and is now free to move in a more accurate direction. The accurate direction was the same one he had been moving in since the bookshop in Basel, inward, deeper into the inner life. Not avoiding the world, but understanding that the world's questions could only be answered from the inside out. He began in 1911 to read more deeply into Buddhist thought. Not as doctrine, he was constitutionally allergic to doctrine, but as psychology. The Four Noble Truths of the Buddha were not, as they sometimes appear to Western readers, a pessimistic account of human experience. They were, Hesse understood, a clinical description of what the mind was actually doing and a set of instructions for what to do about it. Life involves suffering. Suffering arises from craving. Craving can be seen clearly and released. There is a path of practice that leads to that release. This was, Hesse saw, not entirely different from what Jung was saying, not different from what Schopenhauer had said, not different from what his grandfather had understood, standing in the heat of Kerala, translating scripture with the care of a man who knew that the text was saying something true, even if the language was not his. The river he had not yet written. He could feel it, waiting. Tonight, let the thoughts that are moving through you move without you chasing them. You do not need to catch them. They do not need to be caught. He had not yet written Siddhartha. It was 10 years away. He was 34, back in Europe. Living in Bern now, the marriage to Maria growing more distant, the inner life growing louder. He knew the book was coming in the way that writers sometimes know, not as an idea, but as a pressure, a presence behind the daily work, waiting for the right conditions. The right conditions would require his own breakdown first. The book could not be written until he had lived what Siddhartha would live. This is the thing Hesse came to understand slowly, through the writing and the destroying and the years of trying to write the right book too soon. You cannot write what you have not become. The story comes out of the life that has been lived, not the life that has been imagined. He had imagined plenty. He needed to live. Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet who had won the Nobel Prize in 1913, wrote about the divine as the thing that was always arriving, always in the act of arriving, never fully arrived, the way the horizon retreats as you walk toward it. This was not a statement of despair for Tagore. It was a statement of richness. The divine was not absent. It was in the moving toward. Hesse read Tagore in these years and recognized the description. The searching was not a failure. The searching was the content. The river was waiting to be written. The ferryman was waiting to speak. The words would come when he had crossed the water himself. Let your body rest. The night is long and patient. We are moving through this slowly, the way water moves. There is a sentence near the end of Siddhartha. Near the end, not the end, that most people reach half asleep. It is not a famous sentence. It is not the one quoted in introductions or printed on bookmarks. It is a sentence that Hesse wrote knowing that the people who needed it most would hear it when they were not quite conscious. We will reach it tonight. We are not yet close, but we are moving toward it. Chapter 9, a sentence near the end of the book. Hold that for a moment. The sentence is coming. But before the sentence, there is the man who writes it. And before the man who writes it, there is the man who had to be broken into his proper shape by a world that could not accommodate what he had been born with. 1914. The Great War. Hesse was 37 when the war started. He was living in Bern, separated from Maria, working with the German Prisoners of War Welfare Organization, organizing books for prisoners, managing correspondence, trying to do something useful with the wreckage. He was not a soldier. His health prevented it. He was also not a patriot, not in the way the war required. He wrote an essay in 1914 called "O Friends, Not These Tones," a reference to Beethoven, to the Ode to Joy, to the idea that there was a different register available to human beings than the one that sent them to kill each other. He called on German writers not to place their pens in service of the war machine. He called for a Europe that was larger than its nations. He was called a coward, a traitor. Friends he had known for years sent him letters of contempt. The German literary establishment, which had admired him, withdrew. His mail was opened. He was watched. He continued. He had never been able to be what others needed him to be. He was not going to start with something this large. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who had spent his reign fighting wars he believed were necessary, and writing in his private journal about the futility of war, had written, "Whatever is beautiful about life does not depend on whether those around you applaud it." The Stoic philosophers understood something that the war fever of 1914 had forgotten. The only thing a person could control was what they did with the circumstances they were given. not the circumstances themselves. Only the response. The war continued. Hesse worked with the prisoners' books. He wrote. His father died in 1916. His son, Martin, fell critically ill. His wife, Maria, entered a sanatorium. And then Hesse himself collapsed. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. Let your breathing be exactly what it is. A collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives as an inability to continue doing the things you were doing before without any clear single cause. The body simply stops cooperating with the schedule. Hesse stopped sleeping. He stopped eating properly. He stopped being able to write. He moved through the days with the feeling that the person doing the moving was not quite real. This is the third open loop I am leaving here for tonight. There is a sentence near the end of Siddhartha, the book Hesse wrote on the other side of this collapse, that he placed there knowing that most readers would not catch it in the daylight. He wrote it for the reader who hears it at the edge of sleep when the day's argument has stopped. When your mind is where it is right now, we will find it in the second half of the night. It is worth waiting for. The river he had not yet seen was waiting. The ferryman had not yet spoken. A small room, a lamp, a man, still writing. There is something Hesse understood about the sentence that keeps not coming. He had known the feeling from the earliest days, the sense that the most important thing you want to say is always one draft away, always just out of reach, retreating as you approach it. And yet the approaching was not wasted. Every page that failed was also a page that cleared the ground. The words that would not come were making room for the words that eventually would. He wrote in a letter to a friend that the days when nothing emerged were perhaps the most necessary days. The writing was not only in the sentences. It was also in the sitting, in the patience, in the willingness to return to the desk, even when the desk had nothing to offer. The patience itself was a form of writing. The waiting was the work. Siddhartha had not yet seen the river, but he was walking toward it. The walking was not failure. The walking was already the arrival, though he did not yet know that. He would not know it until much later, and that was precisely as it needed to be. Let the weight of the bed hold you. The night is generous. The sentence is coming. Chapter 10, The Language of Searching. There is a form of writing that is performed, and there is a form that is discovered. Most of Hesse's early work, from Peter Kamenzind through the novels of the Geisenhofen years, belonged to the first category. Beautifully performed, carefully crafted, true to his own experience in the way that a good portrait is true, accurate in the features, faithful in the likeness, and yet not quite the living person. He knew this. He knew the difference between the two kinds of writing, and he had not yet found his way to the second one. The book that was waiting, the river book, the book about the search that ends not in arrival but in something else. He could feel it, but he could not write it yet. The language of searching had not yet come. When you are searching for the right language, you read everything. You are not reading for information. You are reading the way a musician listens to other musicians, for rhythm, for breath, for the thing beneath the notes. Hesse read Sanskrit texts in translation, he read the Pali Canon, he read the Upanishads again. He read Meister Eckhart, the medieval German mystic who had written about the ground of the soul, the Seelengrund, as the place where the human self and the divine were no longer separate, where all the noise of the individual life fell away to reveal something simple and bright and permanent. If your mind has been wandering, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. Eckhart had preached in German, which was itself an act of democratization, not Latin, not the language of the academy, but the language of the marketplace and the kitchen. He wanted the idea accessible. He wanted it to reach people who were not scholars. He wrote, "You do not need to seek God far away. He is not far away. He is never further from you than you are from yourself." Hesse read this and recognized it as another version of what the Upanishads had said, what his grandfather's India had suggested, what the river in Cal had been saying to the boy who walked beside it in the evenings. The searching is not the problem, but the searching in the wrong direction is. Outward, always outward, toward achievement, toward approval, toward the accumulated weight of what other people call success, and the thing being searched for is in the opposite direction. This was 1916, 1917. The world was destroying itself on the fields of France and Belgium and the Somme. Hesse was in Switzerland, barely functional, reading mystics. He was finding the language. The prose of Siddhartha, when it finally came, would be different from anything he had written before. Not ornate, not difficult, a kind of deliberate simplicity. In the same way that very still water looks simple and is simple in one sense, and also contains depths that are not visible from the surface. You do not need to follow every word. The parts that matter will find you. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, had written about a phenomenon he called the stream of consciousness. The idea that the mind did not think in separated, distinct thoughts, but in a continuous flowing movement, one thing blending into the next, perception and memory and anticipation all running together. James saw this as the accurate description of what consciousness was actually like. Not a train of beads, a river. The metaphor was everywhere in Hesse's reading. The river in Cal, the river in Siddhartha, the stream of consciousness in James, the ground of the soul in Eckhart, all pointing to the same thing. There is something moving through you right now that is not made of your thoughts and is not troubled by them. It was here before the thoughts came, and it will be here after. What made Hesse's searching distinctive was its honesty about the cost of searching. He did not romanticize the restlessness. He did not pretend the years of instability had been secretly comfortable. They had been difficult, and he said so. But he also said, in letter after letter across 6 decades, that the difficulty had been precisely what made the arrival meaningful. A peace that has not been earned through its opposite is not peace. It is numbness. He had been numb at certain points in his life, and he had known the difference. The searching had been painful. The pain had been necessary. The language emerging from that pain was worth every year it had taken to find. The language was almost ready. The book was almost ready. The breakdown was necessary first. Chapter 11. What Sinclair found in the night. Before Siddhartha, there was Demian. Hesse wrote Demian in 1917, in the middle of his worst period, in a kind of sustained, feverish clarity that he later described as something taking him over rather than something he decided to do. He published it under a pseudonym, Emile Sinclair, the name of the narrator, because he did not want the book associated with the name that had become famous, the name that came with expectations of a certain kind of literary performance. The first line of Demian: I wanted only to try to live in accord with the promptings which came from my true self. Why was that so very difficult? It is still one of the most exact sentences in the literature of the inner life. Sinclair, the narrator, is a boy who discovers, slowly and through a series of strange encounters, that there is a version of himself underneath the compliant son and the good student and the member of the expected social world. That version is older and stranger and more honest. He does not know if it is better. He knows it is more true. Demian, the mysterious older boy who appears as a guide, tells Sinclair early in the novel, the bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who would be born must first destroy a world. Hesse's interpreters have spilled great quantities of ink on this line. It is taken to mean radical individualism or Jungian individuation or the Nietzschean will. What it meant to Hesse at the time of writing was simpler. It meant the life that has been given to you is a structure. It is a good structure, perhaps. It was built with love, in some cases. But it is a structure, and you are not the structure. You are the thing that was placed inside it. And there comes a point where the structure must be broken open, not destroyed, not discarded, but broken, so that the thing inside can take its actual shape. Feel the weight of the blanket. Feel the dark of the room. He published Demian under the pseudonym in 1919. It won a major literary prize for new writers. The judges did not know it was Hesse. When the pseudonym was withdrawn, the literary world was startled. The man who had written the charming rural novels of Peter Kamenzind was also the man who had written this dark and searching interior novel about a boy becoming himself. They were not as different as they seemed. They were both about the same journey. Hesse had just gotten closer to the truth of it. Emile Sinclair is, in the novel, looking for the mark of Cain. He has been told that the mark is a sign of shame, the murderer's brand. Demian teaches him to see it differently. Cain was the one who went his own way, the one who refused the crowd, and the people who put the mark on him as a curse were afraid of what he had chosen. The mark was not shame, it was individuality, the mark of the person who has stopped pretending to be part of a herd they do not belong to. The book was published the same year as Siddhartha's first draft. Hesse was becoming the writer he had always been trying to become. He was also, in the same year, beginning the therapy that would help him understand what had been driving the search all along. What the breakdown of 1916 revealed, and what Hesse spent the rest of his life slowly articulating, was that the inner life does not wait for permission. It arrives when it is ready. It surfaces in the middle of the night, in the middle of a marriage, in the middle of a war that makes all private suffering seem small and yet makes it seem simultaneously more urgent than ever. Jung had taught Hesse that the unconscious is not the enemy. It is the part of the self that has been carrying what the conscious mind refused to hold. When it finally speaks, the speech is not madness. It is honesty. It is the self, finally telling the truth to itself after years of polite evasion. The crisis was also a return. The man who emerged from it was not a new person. He was the old person, finally meeting himself. The quiet of that encounter had taken 40 years to arrive, but it had arrived. And that arrival was, in its way, a form of peace. The night is very quiet. The questions that have been with you all day are resting somewhere. Let them rest. Chapter 12. The year everything came apart. In 1916, Hermann Hesse wrote in his journal, "I have been performing the role of myself for so long that I am no longer certain who is performing and who is watching." His father died that year. Hans Hesse had been ill for some time, and the death was not a surprise, but the grief was. Grief rarely waits politely until we have prepared for it. His son Martin fell critically ill. A child's serious illness reaches the parts of a parent's interior that ordinary daily life keeps sealed. Hesse sat beside the boy's bed in the hospital and felt the inadequacy of everything he had read and learned and believed. The books did not help. The philosophy did not help. The searching of 20 years arrived at a hospital bed and had nothing to say. His wife Maria was in a mental institution. This was not a sudden development. Her mental health had been declining for years, partly, Hesse believed, under the weight of a marriage that had required too much of her. He carried guilt about this, alongside the grief and the fear. And then he himself stopped functioning. The word that was used at the time was nervous exhaustion. We might use other words now. What it felt like from the inside, Hesse wrote later, was a sudden and complete withdrawal of the energy that had kept the system running. As if the body had been paying a debt in silence for many years, and one day simply stopped. He could not write. He could not sleep. He moved through the days with the feeling that the person doing the moving was a construction, a habit, a set of behaviors that had been assembled a long time ago for purposes that no longer applied. Let your breath move slowly. Nothing is asked of you right now. The air is easy. He was referred to a psychiatrist named Joseph Lang in Lucerne. Lang was a student of Carl Jung, not an analyst in full Jungian practice, but someone who had absorbed enough of Jung's understanding to offer something different from the standard rest cures of the period. He did not prescribe sedatives and sea air. He asked questions. He asked Hesse to talk about his dreams. He asked Hesse to describe the moments in his childhood when he had felt most himself. He asked Hesse to describe the things he most feared. He asked Hesse to describe the parts of himself that he had hidden from the world. These were not in 1916 ordinary questions for a psychiatrist to ask. Lang was practicing something new, and Hesse, who had spent his whole life trying to understand the inside of himself through literature and philosophy and the reading of mystics, found that being asked direct questions by someone who listened carefully and without judgment was something else entirely. You are not, in the end, the thoughts you have about yourself. You are not the story you tell yourself in the dark. You are something that precedes all of that, something that watches the thoughts and the story with something like curiosity, something like patience. Lang did not say this to Hesse in so many words. He let Hesse discover it. The discovery took years. It began in 1916 in a consulting room in Lucerne, with a man who had spent too long performing himself finally being asked to stop. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Never confuse what is changing with what is constant. The thoughts change, the moods change, the circumstances change. The thing that is watching the changes is not itself changing." Hesse did not need to read this. By 1916, he had lived it. The year that everything came apart was also the year that the most important things came together. Hesse's first marriage ended. His son was institutionalized. His mother died. His own nervous collapse had been building for a decade and finally arrived. And from within all of that, in the sessions with Lang, and then in the intense creative activity that followed, something opened that had not been opened before. The suffering had broken through a wall he had not even known was there. On the other side of the wall was Siddhartha. On the other side of the wall was the understanding of the river that would take another 5 years to fully articulate, but that he could now finally feel in his body as true. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote that we must assume our existence as broadly as we in any way can. The year everything came apart was the year Hesse finally assumed his. The breadth of it surprised him. The year everything came apart was the year Siddhartha became possible. Chapter 13, Dr. Lang, and the basement room. Joseph Lang's consulting room was in the basement of a house in Lucerne. This detail is worth noting. The talking cure, as it had come to be called, happened underground. Below the street level, below the ordinary daylight world, in a room where the outside did not arrive easily. It was the right architecture for the work. Hesse went twice a week. He sat in a chair across from Lang and talked. He talked about his father, who had wanted a minister. He talked about his mother, who had recognized something in her son that she could not follow. He talked about the seminary wall, the field, the rain. He talked about the year he had tried to die at 15 and about what had changed afterward. He talked about Maria. He talked about the war. He talked about the two voices. Lang listened. Lang asked questions. Lang did not provide answers. This was the method that Carl Jung had developed, drawing on Freud but departing from him in significant ways. Freud believed that the unconscious was primarily a repository of repressed drives and forbidden wishes, that the work of analysis was to drag these things into consciousness and neutralize them. Jung believed the unconscious was more than a basement for unwanted thoughts. He believed it was the source of the self's deepest wisdom, that it communicated through dreams and images and intuitions, and that the work of analysis was not to drain it, but to learn to listen to it. Hesse did not need to be told about the unconscious. He had been living with the feeling of it for 20 years. What he needed was a methodology for the listening. Let your body settle completely into the surface beneath you. The night is very quiet now. In the Jungian framework, the process of becoming oneself, individuation, involved engaging with what Jung called the shadow, the parts of the self that had been denied or suppressed or pushed down because they did not fit the life one was expected to live. The withdrawn minister's boy, the expelled seminary student, the voice that had wanted to be a poet instead of a good son. These parts did not disappear when they were suppressed. They went underground. They came back in dreams, in anxieties, in the persistent feeling that the life one was living was not quite real. What happened in the basement room in Lucerne was that Hesse began the process of reclaiming those parts. Not as a therapeutic exercise. As an act of retrieval, these pieces belong to me, and I have been leaving them outside because I was afraid of them, and now I am going to let them back in. The process was painful in the way that reunion is sometimes painful. The thing you have been keeping out comes back, changed, or perhaps you are changed, and the meeting is not a simple matter. He painted during this period. He had always been able to draw, but he discovered in the Lucerne years a capacity for watercolor that he had not known was there. The paintings were of mountains, flowers, the Ticino landscape. They were not symbolic. They were direct. This valley, this hill, this light, at 4 in the afternoon in October. They did not argue. They simply looked. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, who had lived his entire life as a slave before buying his freedom and establishing a school, had written, "You are not troubled by the things that happen to you, but by the opinions you form about them. Not the event, the story you tell about the event." In the basement room, Lang was helping Hesse examine the stories he had been telling about himself. The story that he was someone who could not be contained. The story that he was fundamentally unsuited to ordinary life. The story that the searching would never end. Some of these stories were accurate, some of them were not. Distinguishing between them was the work. The river was still waiting to be written. He was almost ready. Notice the weight of your body. Notice the breath. The room is holding you. The night is doing what it came to do. Chapter 14, the first version of the river. Siddhartha. First version, 1919. He wrote the first half of the novel quickly, in a few months, drawing on everything he had read about the Buddha's life and the Indian philosophical tradition, drawing on the sessions with Lang, drawing on 20 years of searching and the new clearness that the breakdown had given him about what the search had actually been for. The story. Siddhartha is the son of a Brahmin. He is intelligent, beautiful, beloved by everyone, spiritually advanced beyond his years. And he is searching for something he cannot find in the role he has been given. He leaves his family's house. He joins a group of ascetics, learning to fast and meditate and deny the body. He masters their practices. He is still searching. He encounters the Buddha. He listens to the Buddha's teaching and understands it perfectly. And then he declines to follow it. This is the moment that most readers miss the significance of. Siddhartha does not decline because the teaching is wrong. He declines because he understands it clearly enough to know that understanding alone cannot be transmitted. He tells the Buddha, "Your teaching is perfect and complete." The suffering is explained, the path is shown. And yet there is something it does not contain. The thing that made you yourself, the direct experience of what you found under the Bodhi tree. That thing cannot be passed from teacher to student. Each person has to live their own way to it. The Buddha, in Hesse's novel, acknowledges this with a small smile. It is one of the few moments in the book where the tone is almost warm. Hesse wrote the first half, arrived at the river, and stopped. He could not write the river. He knew the river was there. He had felt it coming since the first page. He had been building toward it since childhood, since Kau, since the Naygold. But now, facing the page where Siddhartha would first come to the water and encounter the ferryman, he could not write it. Let your breath be soft. Let your thoughts be whatever they are. He set the novel aside. For 2 years, he did not touch it. He painted. He worked in his garden in Montagnola, a village in the Ticino hills where he had moved in 1919, renting a small house called the Casa Camusi, which had a view over Lake Lugano and was, he said, the place where he could finally breathe. He wrote essays, letters, short pieces. He did not write the river. He was waiting to understand what the river said. Viktor Frankl, who would not publish his account of the concentration camps until decades later, but who had already begun thinking about what it meant to find meaning in suffering, wrote about the space between what happens and how we respond. That space, Frankl believed, was where human freedom lived. The response was the thing we could choose. Hesse was in that space for 2 years. Between the first half of Siddhartha and the second, between the collapse and the recovery, between who he had been and who he was becoming. And then, in 1921, he went back to Montagnola and wrote The River. He wrote it in 3 weeks. The second half of Siddhartha, The River, the ferryman, the learning to listen, the resolution, arrived in a rush, the way things sometimes arrive when you have been patient long enough. The night is generous. You do not need to rush anything. He did not know, when he wrote it, that Siddhartha would become one of the most widely read novels of the 20th century. He was a middle-aged writer in a small Swiss village, writing the book he had needed to write for 20 years, finally able to write it because he had lived enough to know what the river meant. Hesse knew from the first pages that this version of the novel was different from anything he had written before. The prose had a quality of stillness that his earlier work, however accomplished, had not possessed. He was no longer performing certainty. He was not trying to impress or to persuade. He was simply listening to what the story already knew and writing it down as faithfully as he could. The years of analysis had given him access to a register of self that was quieter than the one he had been writing from before, less defended, less anxious to be understood, more willing to simply be. A sentence, when it is written from that place, carries a quality that the reader can feel even if they cannot name it. It is the quality of something true. The river knew everything. You only had to learn to listen. Chapter 15. What Govinda watched for. Govinda is the friend. He accompanies Siddhartha from the beginning, from the Brahmin family's house, through the years with the ascetics, to the encounter with the Buddha. He is faithful, attentive, devoted. He has known Siddhartha since childhood. He follows where Siddhartha leads. And then, at the Buddha's grove, Govinda makes a different choice. Siddhartha declines to follow the Buddha and goes his own way. Govinda stays. He becomes a monk. He follows the teaching. He commits to the path. The novel follows Siddhartha, not Govinda. But Govinda appears again and again throughout. An old man now, a monk still faithful, still practicing, still watching. He has spent his life doing what he was taught. He is at peace, and he is still searching. This is one of the things Hesse understood that made Siddhartha a richer book than a simple account of spiritual journey. The path that works for one person does not work for another. Govinda chose the right path for Govinda. It was not the right path for Siddhartha. Both men were sincere. Both men were honest. The paths were different because the people were different. Hesse had learned this through his years of reading and therapy and what he called the inner work. You could read every spiritual text ever written, and he had read a great many of them, and still not be any closer to the actual experience they were describing. The text was not the thing. The path was not the thing. The experience of the thing was the thing, and that could not be transmitted. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath move through you without effort. Govinda appears at the end of the novel as an old man, still kind, still sincere, still a little sad in a way he cannot explain. He has spent his life in the right practice, doing what the teacher taught, and something is still missing. Not the practice itself. The practice has been good, has been honest, has given his life shape and community and purpose, but something. He meets Siddhartha again at the river, old men both. And Siddhartha tries to tell him what he has found. He cannot quite succeed because of the thing he told the Buddha 60 years earlier. The teaching cannot be transmitted. Understanding cannot be given from the outside. It can only be recognized from the inside. Carl Jung wrote about this in the context of psychotherapy. The analyst cannot make the patient whole. The analyst can only create the conditions in which the patient's own wholeness can emerge. The healing is not done to the patient. It is done by the patient, through the patient, when the conditions are right. Govinda kisses Siddhartha's forehead. And in that touch, in that moment of genuine contact between two old men who have known each other their whole lives, something happens that Hesse could not describe in ordinary language, and so, described in the language of vision, Govinda sees all the faces, all the people who have lived and will live, the river of them, the smile of the universe. He weeps. He does not know why. He does not need to know why. Let the night be whatever it is. You do not need to know why. The encounter between Govinda and Siddhartha at the end of the novel is, for Hesse, the central image of the difference between the two kinds of spiritual life. One is the life of faithful following, of accepting the framework that a teacher provides, and living within it with dedication and sincerity. The other is the life of direct search, of refusing every framework, however perfect, in favor of the direct experience of what the framework points at. Hesse did not argue that one path was superior to the other. Both Govinda and Siddhartha arrived at something real. The difference was in what arrived. Govinda arrived at devotion, at peace within a practice. Siddhartha arrived at something that was harder to describe because it had no name, a quality of presence that was indistinguishable from the river itself. Both are available. Neither can be taken from the outside. Both require the whole of a life. Feel the weight of your body. Feel the dark. Let the breath be completely easy. Chapter 16. The Student Who Could Not Be Taught. In the middle section of Siddhartha, after leaving the ascetics and before finding the river, Siddhartha does something unexpected. He goes into the city. He takes a lover. He takes a courtesan as his teacher, because she knows something the ascetics did not. She knows about the body, about pleasure, about the texture of the material world. He becomes wealthy. He plays dice. He eats well. He spends money. He lives, for years, in the world of ordinary human pleasure and ordinary human suffering. This section disturbs some readers who come to Siddhartha expecting a linear spiritual ascent. The hero is supposed to go toward the light, not toward the merchant's house and the gambling table. But Hesse knew what he was doing. Siddhartha could not understand the river if he had never understood the city. He could not learn to listen if he had never fully felt the weight of what listening was a relief from. The teacher who matters most in this middle section is not a wise person. It is the experience itself. Siddhartha learns from his own confusion, his own exhaustion, his own growing feeling that the comfortable life is as empty as the ascetic life, that neither extreme contains the thing he is looking for. He has been a student all his life, of the Brahmin teachers, of the ascetics, of the Buddha, now of Kamala, the courtesan. Each teacher has given him something real, but he has never been able to receive the essential thing from any of them, because the essential thing cannot be given. It can only be grown from the inside by the person doing the living. Feel the bed beneath you. The weight of you is real. The night is real. There is a verified line in Siddhartha that Hesse wrote, knowing it was the book's central statement. Siddhartha encounters the Buddha, and the Buddha's teaching is perfect, logically complete, compassionately framed, practically useful. Siddhartha listens to all of it and says, in effect, This is perfect teaching. And then he leaves. When Govinda asks him why, Siddhartha says, wisdom cannot be imparted. That is the line, 4 words in the Rosner translation. The rest of the novel is an illustration of what those 4 words mean. Wisdom is not information. Information can be imparted. Wisdom is something else. The integration of knowledge into a person's actual way of being, so that it changes not just what they think, but what they are. That kind of change cannot be passed from teacher to student like a physical object. It has to be lived into, slowly, through all the mistakes and blind alleys and wrong turns and recoveries that a person's actual life provides. Siddhartha had to go to the city. He had to lose his money. He had to lose Kamala. He had to arrive at the river broken before the river could teach him. Rainer Maria Rilke, writing to a young poet who wanted to know how to live, wrote, "I want to beg you, as much as I can, dear sir, to be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves." And then the injunction that everyone remembers: live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. The questions could not be answered from the outside. They had to be lived from the inside. Siddhartha lived his way into the answer. This is what Siddhartha discovered at the river and what Hesse discovered at his writing desk in Montagnola, that the answers to the deepest questions do not come from accumulating more information, more experience, more wisdom from more teachers. They come from the willingness to stop running from the question itself. The question is not a problem to be solved, it is a companion to be accepted. When Siddhartha sat with the river and stopped trying to understand it, the river did not become less mysterious, it became more beautiful. The mystery and the beauty were the same thing. He had been trying to solve what was only ever meant to be loved. The night holds this same quality. The dark does not need to be understood. It does not need to be made into something other than what it is. It is here. You are here. The breath is here. Nothing is required beyond that. The night is patient. You are living your way into something, even now, in the dark, even in sleep. The questions are doing their work. Chapter 17. The ferryman speaks very little. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are at the river now. Vasudeva is a minor character in the sense that he has few lines. He is present in the novel for a significant portion of its second half, and he says almost nothing. He is a ferryman. He transports people across a river in a small boat. He has been doing this for decades. He is not famous. He is not learned in the way that the Brahmins are learned, or the ascetics, or the Buddha. He has spent his life on the water. When Siddhartha arrives at the river, broken and suicidal, Vasudeva takes him across without asking questions. He feeds him, he lets him sleep in his hut. In the morning, he asks Siddhartha what he has learned from the river. Siddhartha is astonished. No one had ever asked him what he had learned from anything in that way, not what he had been taught, not what he had read, not what a teacher had given him. What had he, Siddhartha himself, directly experienced. He says, "I have learned that the river is connected to everything. I have learned that the voice of the river is the voice of all things at once." Vasudeva nods. He has known this for years. He had no word for it. He simply knew it. This is the first teaching of Vasudeva, not a teaching in words, but an example of what it looks like when a person has stopped fighting their life and is simply living it. Vasudeva is not enlightened in any performance sense. He is not radiant. He does not give lectures. He rows the boat. He listens. He nods. He makes the fire. He is present in the most complete sense possible. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, writing much later, described the face of another person as the first call to ethics. When you truly see someone's face, not their utility, not what they represent, not what you want from them, you are confronted with the irreducible fact of their existence, and that fact makes a claim on you. Vasudeva sees Siddhartha's face. Most of us have been seen that way very rarely. The experience of being fully seen, not evaluated, not categorized, not needed, is unusual enough that most people, when it happens, do not quite know what to do with it. Siddhartha does not know what to do with it. He stays at the river for decades. Let your breath be slow and full. The weight of the night is soft. Vasudeva does not teach by speaking. He teaches by being present with such completeness that being in his presence is itself the teaching. He has learned this from the river, which does not teach at all, which simply is in its constant moving and sounding until you are quiet enough to hear what it is saying. The river is saying everything at once. It takes a long time to become quiet enough to hear even part of it. Hesse wrote Vasudeva out of his experience with Joseph Lang in Lucerne, and out of his experience with the years of Jungian work, and out of something older than that. The memory of his grandfather describing the Indian teachers who taught primarily through silence and presence. Vasudeva is an image of a way of being that the Western world had largely forgotten, attentive, unhurried, present, not performing. The river does not hurry. You do not need to hurry. Vasudeva is one of the most quietly radical figures in all of Hesse's work. He does not teach with words, with argument, with the display of knowledge that Siddhartha had encountered in the Samanas and the Brahmins. He teaches by listening. He listens to Siddhartha with the same completeness with which he listens to the river, without judgment, without urgency to fix, without the need to have the conversation arrive anywhere in particular. He holds space. And in holding that space, he creates the conditions in which Siddhartha can begin to hear himself. What Siddhartha most needed was not someone to give him the answer. He needed someone whose presence made the question bearable. Many of us have needed this. Few of us have been lucky enough to find it. Hesse found it in Jung, and before Jung in his father, and before his father in the river he had not yet reached. We carry our Vasudevas inside us, somewhere, waiting to be recognized. The room is dark. Someone is sitting with you in it. The silence between you is not empty. It is full. Feel the dark of the room. The breath is enough. The night is here. Chapter 18. 1,000 names for the same place. The river in Siddhartha has a voice. Siddhartha hears it slowly, over years. It says Om, the sound that the Hindu and Buddhist traditions use as the beginning and end of prayer, the vibration that is said to contain all sound. It also says every voice Siddhartha has ever heard. His father's voice, Kamala's voice, his son's voice. The voices of people he has never met, who lived before him and will live after. The river is not a metaphor. In Hesse's understanding of it, it is an actual description of the way reality is, not separated into individual things that exist independently, but a continuous movement of one thing through many forms, none of the forms separate from the others, all of them the same substance at different moments of expression. This is what the Vedantists called Brahman, the universal consciousness of which individual consciousness is a wave, not a separate entity. This is what Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher, called God, or nature, one infinite substance, of which everything that exists is a mode or expression. This is what Lao Tzu pointed at with the Tao, the thing that cannot be named because it underlies all names. Different cultures, different centuries, different vocabularies. One river. Let your body settle. The breath is moving on its own. What Siddhartha learns from Vasudeva at the river is not a doctrine about this unity. He does not arrive at an intellectual conclusion. He learns to hear it. The difference is enormous. An intellectual conclusion can be rejected. It can be argued with. It can be replaced by a better one. What you hear with the whole body, in the way that you hear a piece of music that moves you when you were not expecting to be moved. That cannot be argued with. It is not a belief. It is an experience. William James, in The Varieties of Religious Experience, documented case after case of what he called mystical experience. Experiences in which the ordinary boundaries of the self fell away, and what remained was a sense of unity with everything, a quality of light and rightness and belonging that could not be translated into ordinary language without losing most of its content. James was not himself religious in any conventional sense. He was a psychologist. And as a psychologist, he noticed these experiences were real. They happened to ordinary people. They changed the people they happened to. They were not pathological. They were not delusions. They were a category of experience that the Western tradition had largely refused to take seriously, and that the Eastern traditions had spent thousands of years developing practices to encourage. Hesse understood mystical experience not as a special event, but as something available to anyone who became quiet enough and present enough, not transcendence. Immanence. The sacred was not elsewhere. It was in the river. It was in the sound of the river. It was in the quiet that came when you stopped fighting what the river was saying. You do not need to name it. The name is not the thing. Feel the sound of the room around you. Even the silence has texture. Let it be what it is. He wrote in his journal in Montagnola, I have spent my whole life looking for the word that contains it. I think the river knew all along that there was no such word. The river does not need words. It simply says Om and waits for you to stop asking it to say something else. Hesse returned to the word Om throughout his life, not because he was a practitioner of any religious tradition, but because the word pointed at something no other word in any language he knew had managed to point at as cleanly. It pointed at the sound beneath all sounds, the presence beneath all presence, the thing that remained when everything else had been named, and the naming had been exhausted. The river said it, the night said it. The breath, at its most natural and least effortful, said it. He wrote that he had spent most of his life searching for the right word and had gradually come to understand that the right word was not a word at all. It was a sound the body already knew how to make. It was the sound of being alive without needing to be anything other than alive. You already know this sound. You were born knowing it. The search has always been a return, 1,000 names for the same place. And the place does not need a name. Chapter 19. The Man in the Wolf Coat. In 1927, Hermann Hesse published Steppenwolf. He was 50 years old. He had been divorced from Maria since 1923. He had remarried Ruth Wenger in 1924, briefly, and that marriage had ended too. He was now with Ninon Dolbin, a Romanian art historian who understood his work and his solitude, and did not try to correct either. They would marry in 1931 and spend the rest of their lives together. He wrote Steppenwolf in what he later described as a crisis of his middle life, not a breakdown in the manner of 1916, but a sustained confrontation with the feeling that he had arrived at 50, having searched for his whole life, and still could not be sure he had found anything at all. The character of Harry Haller, the Steppenwolf, the wolf of the steppes, is a 50-year-old intellectual who despises bourgeois comfort and cannot live without it. He is divided between the cultivated European gentleman, the lover of Mozart and Goethe, the reader of Hesse, the careful man with a clean apartment and good taste, and the wolf, the lawless, hungry, asocial thing that lives inside the gentleman and will not be educated out of existence. Hesse believed, when he finished writing it, that Steppenwolf would destroy what remained of his literary reputation. The book was strange. It included a magic theatre that might be a hallucination. It ended without resolution. The character did not arrive anywhere. He was surprised when it did not destroy his reputation. He was more surprised when, in the 1960s, American university students in the hundreds of thousands adopted it as a defining text. It had taken 40 years for the culture to catch up with what he had written. If your mind has been wandering, that is fine. We are still here. Come back gently. The central insight of Steppenwolf, the one that required the whole apparatus of the novel to arrive at, and that Harry Haller glimpses only at the very end, like a person seeing a sunrise through a gap in the curtains, is that the division is not between two things. It is between the 1,000 things that a human being actually is, that the self misrepresents as a simple division because a simple division is easier to manage. You are not 2. You are not even 20. The self is a multiplicity that has been reduced to a story about 2 for the sake of getting through the day. And the work of the inner life, the individuation, the analysis, the long practice of sitting quietly with yourself, is not to eliminate the division. It is to learn to hear all the voices that are actually there without being destroyed by the noise. The Magic Theatre in Steppenwolf, the place Harry Haller enters in the novel's surreal final section, is not a metaphor for madness. It is a metaphor for the unconscious, the place where all the suppressed and divided parts of the self are allowed to exist simultaneously, to play, to be seen without judgment. Hesse had been in something like that theatre himself in the basement room in Lucerne. He had met his voices. He had not resolved them. He had learned to be in the room with them. Carl Jung wrote that integration was not the elimination of the shadow, but the recognition of it, the understanding that the parts of the self you have been suppressing are still parts of the self, and that suppressing them takes enormous energy that could be used for other things. The wolf is not the enemy. The wolf is you. The work is not to cage the wolf. It is to bring the wolf inside, where you can see it and learn what it actually needs. The night is deep now. Let your body be completely still. The wolf in you is also tired. Hesse did not resolve Harry Haller's crisis at the end of Steppenwolf. He could not have resolved it honestly. The resolution was not a dramatic conversion. It was something more modest. The possibility of continuing. The possibility that all of this, the search, the division, the exhaustion, the wolf, was material for a life rather than an argument against one. He is sentenced to live, Haller is told, at the novel's end. Not a death sentence, a life sentence. And implicit in that sentence is the suggestion that the living itself is enough. If you stop requiring it to be something, it is not. Hesse was 50 when he understood this, or began to understand it. The understanding would deepen over the next 35 years on the hillside in Montagnola. Feel the breath. The air is soft. The night is continuing. Chapter 20. What the Garden Taught. The writer, from 1919 until his death in 1962, Hermann Hesse lived in Montagnola. The Casa Camuzzi, the house he first rented. Then, later, a larger house that Ninon found for them, the Casa Bodmer, surrounded by trees and a garden. He planted things. He grew a vegetable garden. He had always grown gardens, back to the years in Geienhofen on the lake. But the gardens in Montagnola were different. They were not the gardens of a man who was trying to put down roots. He had put down roots. These gardens were the work of a man who had understood that the growing of things was a form of attention, and that attention was the practice he needed. He painted. This is the less discussed part of Hesse's life. He made watercolors, hundreds of them, over 40 years, of the Ticino landscape, the villages, the valleys, the hills, the light in different seasons. He was not a professional painter. He never sought exhibition, but he painted consistently, daily almost, because painting required the kind of present moment attention that writing sometimes did and sometimes did not. In painting, you could not plan ahead. The light changed. The color on the palette was not the color you had intended. The brush made marks that were not quite the marks you had envisioned, and you had to work with what you had made rather than what you had planned. Painting was, for Hesse, a practice in responding to what was actually there rather than what should be there. This is harder than it sounds. Most of us have spent a great deal of time trying to make what is actually there conform to what we think should be there, and not very much time accepting the actual and working with it. Let the weight of your body rest fully. The darkness is complete now. The room is holding you. He wrote about the garden in essays, in letters, in poems. Not romantically. He was not a man who romanticized nature into a cathedral. He wrote practically, the garden needs work, it resists you, it does what it does regardless of your plan. The aphids come when you did not invite them, the tomatoes ripen when you are away. The oak grows where it wants to grow, and not where you would have placed it. A life is not very different. It does what it does. The searching requires adjustment to what the life actually is, not what you planned it to be. His friend and neighbor in later years, a writer named Peter Kamenzind, the same name as his first novel, a coincidence that amused him, wrote that Hesse in the garden was unlike Hesse at the desk. At the desk, something was still working, still effortful, still engaged in the long war between the self and the page. In the garden, he was simply there. The hands in the soil, the eyes on the plant, the body doing the work the body knew to do. Aristotle, whose practical ethics Hesse had read in his bookshop years, had written that the good life was not an idea but a practice, a set of habitual actions performed consistently over time until they became second nature. Virtue was not a quality you possessed. It was a quality you practiced daily until you were the person who practiced it. The garden was something like this. The watercolors were something like this. The long decades of letters to strangers who wrote because they were searching were something like this. Hesse answered his mail. This is the detail that most biographers mention and most readers forget. He received in the later decades of his life hundreds of letters per week from people who had read his books and were searching and needed to tell someone. He answered them, not perfunctorily, with care. He wrote to one young man, I cannot tell you what you are looking for. I can tell you that looking for it is the most important thing you can do with your life, and that you are not alone in the looking. He planted things, he painted things, he answered the letters. He was, in Montagnola, finally living in the room that was his own. The night is soft and quiet. Your breathing is settling. The garden does not need anything from you tonight. Chapter 21. A letter he never sent. In 1932, Thomas Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Hesse wrote him a warm letter of congratulation. It was a generous letter and a genuine one. He and Mann had been friends for decades. They had supported each other through difficult literary periods, and Hesse knew that Mann's win was deserved. He also wrote a second letter, which he did not send. The second letter was not unkind. It was honest in a way that the sent letter could not be. It said, approximately, "I have spent many years watching how you inhabit the world, the social ease, the managed public persona, the ability to be in any room and seem at home. And I have wondered, sometimes, whether the ease is real, or whether it costs what I suspect it costs, and whether the cost is worth it for you." He did not send it because it was not precisely Mann's business. And because asking people whether their management of their inner life is working for them is not a question that can be asked from the outside. He burned the second letter, or put it in a drawer. The accounts differ. Either way, it was gone. This was characteristic of the later Hesse. The thought was thought, the honest thing was understood, and then a choice was made about whether the saying of it served anyone. Not suppression, not dishonesty, discernment. Let the thoughts that are with you rest where they are. They will be there in the morning if they need to be. Right now, they do not need to go anywhere. The relationship between Hesse and Mann was one of the more interesting literary friendships of the 20th century. Two writers of enormous stature who were entirely different in temperament and method, who respected each other without quite understanding each other, who sustained their friendship across decades because they recognized something in common underneath the difference. The common thing was this: both had understood early that the outer life and the inner life were in tension, and that managing that tension was the central work of a serious person. They managed it differently. Man managed it through control, through social performance, through the architecture of his public self. Hesse managed it through withdrawal, through the garden, through the long letters to strangers, through the persistent refusal to be managed by anything. Both were right for themselves. Neither method worked for the other. Seneca had written, "From the position of a man who had spent his whole life at the court of Nero and knew what the performance cost, we suffer more in imagination than in reality." Not the events themselves, but the anticipation of them, the rehearsal of them, the replaying of them. This is where most suffering lives. Hesse understood this. His therapy, his garden, his watercolors were all practices in returning to what was actually present, rather than the narrative about what was present. The unsent letter sat in a drawer. The man who had written it went back to his garden. In Montagnola, the light in October came low over the hills and made the olive trees silver. He mixed the colors on the palette and began a new painting. The unsent letter is a form of discernment that the digital age has made obsolete. We send before we have finished thinking. We say before we have understood what we want to say. Hesse, writing by hand in the 1930s, had the natural pause between the thought and the sending, and in that pause he chose. Sometimes he sent, sometimes he filed the thing away for decades and returned to it when the question it addressed had resolved itself. He wrote to a friend in this period, "The most important conversations I have had this decade have been with people who are no longer alive, through books they left behind, and with people I have not yet met, through letters I have not yet written. The present conversation is sometimes the least interesting layer." This was not a prescription for isolation. He answered hundreds of letters every year. He knew the difference between the conversation that clarified and the one that merely filled the silence. Feel the warmth of wherever you are lying. The darkness is complete. The night is patient. Chapter 22. The question that would not leave. There is a question at the center of Hesse's work that he returned to in every novel, every essay, every letter to a stranger who had written because they were searching. The question is, who is doing the searching? Not what are you searching for, not how do you find it, who is it that is searching? This is a question that sounds simple and turns out to be inexhaustible. You begin to investigate it and you discover that the one you call I, the one who wakes up in the morning, who goes to work, who has opinions and memories and plans, is not quite as solid as it seemed. It is a construction, a useful construction, a necessary one, but a construction nonetheless, assembled from the materials of your history and your relationships and your particular nervous system, and not identical with the thing that was there before the construction, or the thing that remains after the performance of selfhood stops. This is where Hesse and Jung converge most productively. Jung called the thing beneath the ego the self, capital S, and said that the work of individuation was the ego's long and difficult recognition that it was not in charge of the larger thing it was embedded in. Hesse called it different things in different books: the Atman, the universal soul, the river, the Om. But what he meant was consistent. There is something in you that is not troubled by your troubles, that is not searching for what you think you are searching for, that has never been lost. If your mind has wandered, that is fine. You do not need to have followed every word. Come back gently. He wrote about this in a 1946 essay called Thanks for Goethe, which was not really about Goethe at all, but about the experience of reading Goethe across a whole life and noticing how the books change as the reader changes. The Faust of the 20-year-old and the Faust of the 60-year-old are not the same book. The words are the same, the reader is different, and the reader's difference is a window into what the reader has become. He was 69 in 1946. He had been reading Goethe for 50 years. What he found, reading him at the end of a long life, was the thing Goethe had been saying from the beginning and that Hesse had only been able to hear partially before. That the searching itself is a form of transformation, and that what is found at the end is not the thing searched for, but the self that was doing the searching changed, deepened, quieter, more honest. The question that would not leave was not answered in the ordinary sense. It was understood. Understanding and answering are different things. A question, lived long enough, becomes a form of companionship. You stop needing it to resolve. You simply carry it, and the carrying shapes you. The night is very deep now. The breath is the only thing that needs to move. In Montagnola, at 69, Hesse was still carrying the question, but he was carrying it differently than he had at 14, at 20, at 40. The question was no longer an anxiety. It was more like a companion, something that had been with him so long it had become familiar. There is a particular kind of maturity that Hesse associated with questions that have been lived with long enough to lose their urgency. The question does not go away. The answer does not arrive. But the relationship between the person and the question changes. What was once a wound becomes, very slowly, a window. You look through it rather than into it. The pain that was once so acute that it prevented you from seeing anything else becomes the very thing through which you begin to see more clearly. This is not resolution. It is something better than resolution. It is integration. The difficulty has been taken into the self and has become part of how the self moves through the world. Siddhartha carried his question that way in the end, not as a burden, not as an achievement, but as a feature of himself, as inseparable from him as his face in the water. The night is moving slowly. There is time. The question you are carrying is not heavier than you can hold. You have been holding it for a long time already. You are stronger than you know. The river kept moving. The question kept asking. Both of them were fine. Chapter 23. What Jung said about the river. The friendship between Hesse and Carl Jung was mostly conducted through letters and reading, not through the kind of regular contact you might expect from two men who spent their careers thinking about the same things. They met. They respected each other. But Hesse was suspicious of analysis as a complete answer, and Jung understood that suspicion and did not push. Jung had developed, over decades of clinical practice, a healthy skepticism of the idea that the analytical relationship could do what it often claimed to do, make a person whole. Analysis could create the conditions for wholeness. It could help a person recognize the parts of themselves they had been denying. It could make the unconscious a little less terrifying. But the wholeness had to come from the person's own life, from the actual experience of living, the relationships, the work, the garden, the paintings, the letters, the long decades of attention to the inner life. Analysis was one tool among many, not the master tool. Jung had read Siddhartha when it was published. He recognized the individuation process described there, the long journey from the inherited identity through the temptations of both extreme asceticism and extreme indulgence to the integration represented by the river as a nearly precise narrative account of what he was trying to describe clinically. He told Hesse in a letter, "You have written about what I am trying to write about, and you have written it better than I have because you have not had to use clinical language." Hesse received this letter in Montenola and put it in a folder with the other letters from people who had said something important. The folder was thick. He kept it. Let the body be completely heavy. Let the breath be slow and deep. What Jung said about the river, not in any single letter, but across the correspondence and in his own writing, was that the river was an image of the unconscious itself, the thing that is always moving, that carries everything in it, that cannot be held still long enough to be examined, but can be listened to, sat beside, attended to over time. The unconscious was not, Jung believed, the enemy that Freud's early work sometimes implied. It was not a basement full of forbidden things. It was a river full of everything: the wisdom of the ancestors, the instincts of the species, the particular wealth of this person's individual life, and yes, the shadow, the suppressed parts, the wolf. All of it moved together in the current. All of it spoke, if you were quiet enough to hear it. The practice of sitting beside the river, which Vasudeva did, which Siddhartha eventually learned to do, which Hesse practiced through his painting and his garden and his 40 years of morning attention to the inner life, was the practice of learning to hear the current. It did not require a special state. It did not require enlightenment. It required only sustained, gentle attention, the willingness to sit without immediately needing to be somewhere else. The night is here. You are already beside the river. You do not need to understand what it is saying. The river does not require comprehension. It only requires that you stop walking away from it. What the river taught Siddhartha was also what decades by Lake Constance and in the gardens of Montagnola had taught Hesse, that the self is not a fixed point, it is a current. It does not stand in one place and accumulate meaning the way a shelf accumulates books. It flows, and in flowing it is different at every moment, while also being recognizably, continuously itself. The paradox is that the more you try to hold yourself still, to define yourself once and for all, to decide who you are and be done with the deciding, the more you feel yourself slipping. But when you allow the flow, when you let yourself be the river rather than the person standing on the bank trying to understand the river, something relaxes. The anxiety about identity quiets. You are not a problem that needs solving. You are a current that needs room to move. The breath moves. The night moves. Nothing is asked of you but presence. Feel your breath. Feel the room. The river is in everything, and it has been here longer than you. Chapter 24. The painter in the mountain town. The watercolors, they survive in collections, in private hands, in a small museum in Montagnola. They are not the work of a master painter. Hesse never claimed otherwise. They are the work of a person who looked at things carefully and translated what he saw into pigment with the kind of attention that most of us give to very few things. The olive trees above the lake, the campanile of the village church, a street in autumn light, a row of vineyards, the mountains in fog, the mountains in snow. The mountains in the burning July light when the Ticino heat made everything shimmer at the edges. He painted the same views in different seasons. He painted the same trees at different times of day. He was not making an argument about the landscape. He was practicing a way of seeing. There is a way of looking at something that is essentially argumentative. You assess the thing, you categorize it, you place it in relation to other things you already know. This is the way most people, most of the time, look at most things. It is efficient and it misses almost everything. There is another way of looking. You let the thing be what it is, and you observe it without deciding in advance what it is. The tree is not the concept tree. It is this tree, this particular assembly of bark and branch and light, here now, not the same as any other tree that has ever existed. And the looking that can receive it fully without immediately processing it into the category trees is the kind of looking that Hesse was practicing. If your mind has been far away, come back gently. We are still here. The night is soft. He wrote about the painting in a letter. I cannot explain what it gives me. It is not information. It is not beauty, exactly. It is the experience of having been present to something that is actually here, rather than something I was expecting to find. The thing that is actually here is always different from the thing I expected. The difference is the gift. This was, he understood, what Vasudeva had been practicing for decades on the river. Not a spiritual practice in the formal sense, a practice of attention. The practice of being fully in the presence of what is actually here, rather than in the presence of one's own thoughts about what is here. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian-American psychologist who would later describe the state of flow, the state of complete absorption in a task, where the gap between the doer and the doing disappears, was describing something Hesse practiced without the clinical framework. In flow, the sense of a separate self observing and judging the activity goes quiet. There is only the activity. The painter and the painting are one thing. The ferryman and the river are one thing. These were not, Hesse believed, mystical states accessible only to a few. They were states that ordinary human consciousness was capable of, that most people had experienced occasionally, in the middle of work that mattered, or in the presence of something beautiful, or at the moment of genuine contact with another person. The tragedy was not that these states were rare. The tragedy was that most people did not recognize them when they happened and did not cultivate the conditions that made them more likely to happen again. You do not need to make anything happen tonight. The conditions are already present. The watercolors Hesse painted in his years in Montagnola are not the work of a great visual artist in the conventional sense. They are the work of a great writer who found in paint a way to say things that prose could not say, a way to be present with light and color and form without needing to explain them, without needing to make them mean anything beyond what they were. Bachelard wrote that a house that has been experienced is not an inert box. It is not just the home of reveries, it is the reverie itself. Hesse's watercolors were like that, not depictions of the landscape, but the landscape itself, transferred into the body of someone who had learned, finally, to see it without wanting to change it. The mountain town did not cure him, it completed him. The painter in the mountain town went on painting. The watercolors accumulated, the olive trees grew, the light changed every day. He put his brush to the paper and let the morning light say whatever it was saying. Chapter 25. When the books stopped helping. There is a moment in every serious intellectual life when the books stop helping. This is not a failure of the books. The books were always exactly what they were, the accounts of other people's experience, arranged in language available to be read. They were never a substitute for the experience itself. They were a preparation for it. Maps, not terrain. For Hesse, this moment came in the years of the Steppenwolf crisis. the years around 1927, when he was 50, and everything he had read and learned and practiced was no longer sufficient to carry him through what he was carrying. The reading had been genuine. The therapy had been genuine. The Montagnola years and the garden and the painting and the letters to strangers, all of it had been genuine. And he was still, at 50, standing in the dark without enough light to see by. He described it, in a late interview, as the moment the floor gave way. Not in the manner of 1916, which had been a collapse. More like the floor becoming transparent. He could see through it to the ground beneath, and the ground was different from what he had expected. There was no crisis. Just the clear, quiet, unwanted knowledge that the architecture he had built, the books, the framework, the beautiful Jungian vocabulary, the years of careful inner work, was a structure and not the thing the structure was built to house. The thing was underneath, still there, still unchanged by all the years of effort. Let your breath slow. Feel the bed beneath you. The floor is holding. Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who had understood the gap between intellectual understanding and actual transformation better than almost anyone, had written that there were 3 stages of existence: the aesthetic, the experience of pleasure and beauty; the ethical, the submission to moral obligation; and the religious, the individual's leap into direct relationship with the Absolute. The first 2 could be managed with intelligence. The third could not. The third required a surrender that intelligence could not perform on behalf of the self. Hesse was not religious in the doctrinal sense, but he understood the structure of what Kierkegaard meant. There was a point in the inner life where effort could no longer carry you, where the reading and the analysis and the careful practices of attention reached their natural limit. And what lay beyond that limit was not more effort, it was the cessation of effort. This is what Siddhartha had learned from the river. Not a technique, the cessation of technique. He sat in his house in Montagnola with the knowledge that he had reached this limit. He did not panic, he painted. He walked in the garden, he wrote to the strangers who had written to him. He answered the letters of young people who were searching. And slowly, over the months and years of that period, something settled. Not resolved, settled. The way water settles when you stop disturbing it, the way a room settles at night when the day's activity has ended and there is nothing more required. The settling was not an arrival. It was a change of quality in the searching itself, from agitated to quiet, from grasping to open, from demanding to patient. This was the teaching he had not been able to find in any of the books. Not because the books had not known it, because it could not be found in books. It had to be lived into. What Hesse came to call this shift was the movement from the head to the heart, not in the sentimental sense, but in the sense of a shift from the processing mind to the attending body. The head wants to categorize, explain, resolve, conclude. The heart, and here he meant something closer to what contemplative traditions call awareness, simply receives. It does not need the experience to mean something beyond what it is. A sound in the dark is a sound in the dark. A breath is a breath. The warmth of a room on a cold night is exactly that, needing no further significance, already sufficient. Hesse had spent the first half of his life trying to think his way into wholeness, and the second half discovering that wholeness was not a thought, it was a quality of attention. You could not think your way there. You could only stop thinking long enough to notice you were already there. The settling continues. The room is exactly as dark as it needs to be. The night is generous with time. The night is very quiet. You are already in the settling. Let it continue. Chapter 26. The third kind of silence. Hesse identified 3 kinds of silence. The first was the silence of waiting. You are quiet because something is about to happen, and the silence is full of anticipation. The mind is not still. The mind is leaning forward. The second was the silence of defeat. You have stopped speaking because there is nothing left to say or because the saying has failed. The silence has the quality of having given up. It is the silence in a room where an argument ended badly. The third kind of silence was different. He did not have a single word for it, in German or in any other language he had read. He described it in different ways in different works. The silence of the river, the silence of Vasudeva listening, the silence of the watercolorist when the brush meets the paper and the mind goes quiet because the hand is doing the work of the mind. It was not the absence of sound. Sound could move through this silence without disturbing it. It was not the absence of thought. Thoughts continued, but they moved through the silence the way birds move through a clear sky. Present, visible, not disturbing the sky. He had experienced this silence occasionally since his 30s in the Luzerne basement, in certain hours at the painting table, in the garden at specific times of the morning when the light was particular and the hands were in the soil. He had understood that it was possible, that it was real, that it was not transcendence, but something simpler and more available than that word implied. What the Steppenwolf years and their aftermath had taught him was that this silence could become the ground of a life rather than an occasional visitor to it, not permanently, not perfectly. But as a default orientation, the thing you returned to when the other kinds of silence had done their work. If your mind has been somewhere else, that is fine. The silence is here when you come back. Pascal had written, from his cell in the 17th century, about the infinite silence of the spaces between the stars, which frightened him. But it was a different kind of silence he was frightened of, the silence of absence, the silence of a universe that did not speak. What Hesse had found was not that silence. What he had found was the silence that was full of everything, the way the river is full of everything, without being troubled by any of it. Meister Eckhart had called this the ground of the soul, the deepest layer of the inner life, below the thoughts and the emotions and the personality and the history, where the individual self and the divine were no longer separate. The ground was always there, Most people never reached it because the layers above it were so active and so loud. The layers above were necessary. Hesse was not arguing against thought or emotion or personality. He was saying that beneath them, available but requiring stillness to be reached, was something that did not need to search. The third kind of silence was not something you achieved. It was something you discovered was already there when you stopped mistaking the first two silences for the only ones available. Let your body be heavy. Let your thoughts move without chasing them. The silence that is full is beneath all the other sounds. He was 70 years old when he wrote most clearly about this. He had been in Montagnola for more than 30 years. The lake was below, the olive trees were outside the window. The watercolors from 4 decades covered the walls of the room where he wrote. The third kind of silence was what he had been searching for since he was 13 and stood in a field in the rain, not knowing what he had run toward. The third kind of silence is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of completion. It is what you find at the end of a long piece of music when the final note has finished ringing and the air has settled and there is nothing left to say because everything has been said. Hesse spent 85 years working his way toward that silence. He arrived at it not by stopping the work, but by continuing it so long and so faithfully that the work itself became quiet. The searching did not stop. It simply became the same temperature as the silence it had been moving through. He sat in the garden at Montagnola in his final years and listened to the olive trees and the lake and wrote in a letter to a young reader that he was, for the first time in his life, content. He had not expected contentment. He had expected more questions. But the questions, in the end, had become the contentment. He had run toward this. Chapter 27, What the Search Was Made Of. Begin to resolve. Siddhartha's long journey from the Brahmin family to the ascetics, to the Buddha, to the city, to the river, was not a journey toward a destination. This is the thing the novel makes clear only at the end, and that takes the whole length of the book to demonstrate. The journey was itself the content of the life. Every stage was necessary. The asceticism was necessary, the city was necessary, the loss was necessary. The near death at the river, when Siddhartha heard the word Om rising from the water below and something in him chose not to fall, was necessary. Not because suffering is good, or because the difficult path is more valuable than the easy one, but because this was the particular shape of this particular person's life, and the searching that moved through it was not a detour from the life, it was the life. Hesse understood this about himself, and he understood it slowly over the course of decades. The seminary wall he had climbed over at 14 was necessary. The workshop and the bookshop were necessary. The 2 failed marriages were necessary, not because he had learned from them in the way that people say you learn from your mistakes, as if learning were a transaction in which suffering is the currency, but because they were the actual material of his actual life, and his actual life was what he had to work with. There is no other life available. There is only this one. Let the breath move through you. Let the weight of the night hold you. You are in the only life you have, exactly where you are. The question that would not leave, who is doing the searching, resolves here or begins to resolve. The answer is not a person. Not the intellectual man in Montagnola with the wire-rimmed spectacles and the Nobel Prize and the 40 years of watercolors. Not the boy who ran away from the seminary. Not the man who wrote Siddhartha in 3 weeks in a rush of recovered clarity. The one doing the searching is the awareness that runs through all of those figures, like the river runs through a landscape. It is the thing that was there in the child watching the Nagold River in Kau. It is the thing that is here now, in you, in this room, at this hour. It has been watching the search without participating in it. It has been waiting without impatience. It has not needed anything. The search was made of everything. The search was made of the river. Marcus Aurelius, in his tent on the Danube, had written, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." What Hesse had lost along the way, the 2 marriages, the years of the breakdown, the books that were burned, the friendships that the war had severed, the Nobel Prize that he received while too ill to go collect it, these were the material of the life, not the failure of the life, the substance. The searching is not the problem. It was never the problem. The problem was believing that the searching was evidence of something missing, when it was evidence of something alive. The river is always moving. The river has never been lost. He wrote in one of his last essays, a few years before his death, "I have spent the whole of my adult life afraid that I was wasting it on the wrong thing. I understood only lately that this fear was itself the wrong thing. The life I was living while fearing it was wasted was already the life. It was not preparation for the life. It was the life." This is what the river finally said to Siddhartha. Not in words. In the way the sound of moving water includes every sound, past and future, grief and joy, his father's voice and his son's voice, and Kamala's voice, and Vasudeva's voice, and the voice of every stranger he had met along the way. The river said it was never a waste. It was always the river. You were always the river. Feel the darkness of the room. Feel the breath. The searching has brought you here, and here is exactly where you need to be. Chapter 28. 40 Years on the Mountain. In the summer of 1919, Hermann Hesse drove to Montagnola with his painting supplies and his books and almost nothing else. He was 42. His first marriage had ended. His father was dead. He had survived his own breakdown. He had written Demian. He was in the middle of Siddhartha, which he had been unable to complete. He rented the Casa Camusi from a count he had met through a friend, and he moved into the simple rooms, and he began. He would not leave Montagnola except for brief trips, for medical treatment, for visits to Zurich to see Jung for the next 43 years. If your mind has been drifting, come back gently. We are still here. The night is generous. 43 years is a long time to stay in one place. For a man whose early life was defined by running away from places, the seminary, Kau, Geienhofen, Bern, he had moved and moved, following the unnamed thing. What had changed? He did not locate the answer precisely. In an essay from 1946, he wrote, "I cannot tell you when Montagnola stopped being a place I lived and became a place I was from. I can only tell you that it happened, that it was not a decision, and that it felt like something I had always known was available and had not been ready for. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard, writing about the poetics of space, the way particular rooms and houses and landscapes shape the consciousness of the people who inhabit them, proposed that we carry within us all the places we have lived, that these places become part of the structure of the inner life, that the house of childhood is never fully left behind. For Hesse, the places that lived in him were Cow, the river, the Black Forest, the grandfather's library, Luzerne, the basement room, the first listening, and Montagnola, the lake, the hills, the garden, the long light of the Ticino afternoons. Montagnola was the place where the searching found its proper pace, not its end, its pace. The difference between searching in agitation and searching in stillness is not the searching, it is the stillness. He painted every morning, he wrote in the afternoons, he walked in the evenings, along the paths above the lake, the same paths, worn smooth by his feet over 40 years. He answered the letters. He planted the garden. He watched the same olive trees change through 4 decades of seasons. He was not bored. This is the important thing to understand about the Montagnola years. The repetition was not dullness, it was depth. Each morning at the same desk was not the same morning. Each walk along the same path was not the same walk. The light changed. He changed. The lake was different at 70 than it had been at 42. Not because the lake had changed, but because the one who was looking at it had. Viktor Frankl wrote that the last of human freedoms was the freedom to choose one's attitude toward what one could not change. Hesse had chosen, in Montagnola, an attitude toward the unresolved question that was not urgency and not despair, but something closer to companionable attention. The question was still there. He was still here. Both of them were getting older. Both of them were, in their way, content. In the mountains, time moves differently. Hesse had known this since his first visits to the Alps as a young man, when the scale of the landscape had done something to the scale of his internal anxieties, not resolved them, but placed them in a proportion that made them more bearable. A worry that fills a room entirely does not fill a mountain range. The mountain does not belittle the worry. It simply provides a context in which the worry can be seen as the size it actually is, rather than the size it feels in the dark at 3 a.m. He wrote that the mountains had taught him that he was neither as significant nor as insignificant as he sometimes believed. He was the right size. The mountains confirmed it without saying a word. The question was still there when he descended. It always was. But it fit inside him more comfortably than it had before. Some things can only be learned from altitude. The mountain was the right place. He had been running toward it since he was 13. Chapter 29. The night Steppenwolf was written. In the winter of 1926, Hesse wrote the central section of Steppenwolf. This is the resolution of the second loop, the one about the burned pages. He was living in Basel at the time, in a rented apartment, having separated from his second wife and not yet settled in Montagnola. He was 50 years old, in the middle of a personal crisis that he could not name, and he wrote. He wrote in a state that he later described as dictation. The story came through him rather than from him. Harry Haller arrived already formed, already speaking, already carrying the exact weight that a 50-year-old intellectual who despises his own comfort carries. He did not plan the book. He did not outline it. He wrote it the way the crisis needed to be written, directly, without safety nets, without knowing where it was going. He had burned drafts before, dozens of drafts, over decades. He knew what the burning felt like. It felt like loss in the moment and like clearing in the aftermath. The bad pages were the pages that were performing. The burned pages were the ones that had been pretending to be something they were not. Steppenwolf was not pretending. He could feel the difference as he wrote it. This was the real page. This was the manuscript that would not be burned. Let the breath be slow and natural. The night is very deep now. What he understood, writing Steppenwolf in the winter of 1926, was that the burning of bad pages had not been an act of self-destruction. It had been an act of fidelity. Fidelity to the book that was actually there, waiting to be written, rather than the book he had imagined he should write. This is the thing about destruction that he never explained directly in his letters, but encoded in his fiction. The clearing is necessary. The things that were built before the right thing could be built have to be cleared away, not because they were failures, because they were the preparation, the learning of what the right thing was not, so that the right thing could be recognized when it arrived. He had spent 20 years burning the wrong pages. Steppenwolf was the first page of the right manuscript. After Steppenwolf, he returned to Montagnola and never wrote another novel with quite that quality of raw exposure. He wrote The Glass Bead Game, an enormous, stately, philosophical novel, arguably his masterpiece in the formal sense, set in a far future world where a community of scholars play an elaborate intellectual game called the Glass Bead Game, which synthesizes all human knowledge into a single practice. It is the opposite of Steppenwolf in tone and temperature. It is cool, ordered, vast. But the same question runs through it. Can the synthesis of all knowledge substitute for the direct experience of what knowledge points at? Can the Glass Bead Game, perfect as it is, give Knecht, the novel's protagonist, what the river gave Siddhartha? The answer, as in Siddhartha, is no. The game cannot be the thing itself. At the end of the Glass Bead Game, Knecht leaves the game and goes into the world, and dies almost immediately in a cold lake. Hesse did not see this as a tragic ending. He saw it as an accurate one. The person who has finally stopped performing and entered the direct experience of their life is fully alive, even in dying. The game was not the life. The lake was the life. The burned pages were the game. Steppenwolf was the lake. The Steppenwolf, the Glass Bead Game, Siddhartha. Each was a different attempt to solve the same problem, and the problem was this: How does a person live fully in the interior life without abandoning the world, and live fully in the world without abandoning the interior life? Hesse never resolved this problem. He circled it, probed it, illuminated it from different angles across 50 years of work, and the circling itself was the answer, or as close to an answer as the problem permitted. You do not solve the problem of how to be fully alive. You practice being fully alive, imperfectly, repeatedly, with whatever materials the day provides. The burned pages were practice. The published books were practice. The mornings in the garden, the letters to strangers, the evenings watching the light change over the lake, all of it was practice, and the practice was the life. The lake was always there. He had always been walking toward it. He arrived the moment he stopped looking for a different destination. Feel the weight of the night. The room is very quiet. Let the breath move. Chapter 30. What remains when the striving stops? We return now to the loop left open in the 3rd chapter, in the rain outside the seminary at Maulbronn in 1892. Hesse had run away. He did not know what he had run toward. In the years that followed, the workshop, the bookshops, the therapy, the novels, the failed marriages, the breakdown, Montagnola, the watercolors, the 40 years of letters answered to strangers who were searching, he came slowly to know what he had run toward that night. He had run toward the cessation of striving. Not in the way that sounds like defeat. The cessation of striving is not the end of effort. He worked until he was 85. He wrote until he could barely hold the pen. He answered letters in the weeks before his death. The effort did not stop. The striving stopped. The difference between effort and striving is the difference between doing something because it is what you do and doing something because you are trying to prove that you are the kind of person who does it. The first is presence. The second is performance. Hesse had been performing since childhood, performing the role of the good minister's son, the promising student, the important writer, the man with the right answers. The breakdown of 1916 was, among other things, the collapse of the performance, not the collapse of the person. The collapse of the idea that the performance and the person were the same thing. What remained after the collapse was the person, stripped of the performance, surprisingly intact. Let your body rest fully. You have been carrying something all day. You can set it down now. He wrote in a late essay about the difference between the man he had appeared to be at 35 and the man he actually was. At 35, the appearance was more impressive than the reality. By 70, the appearance had caught up with the reality, or perhaps the reality had grown until the appearance was simply not very interesting by comparison. The thing that grew was not wisdom in the sense of having answers. It was something quieter. The capacity to be with questions without needing them to resolve. The capacity to be in the presence of the unresolvable without being disturbed by its refusal to resolve. The Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, had worked towards something similar. They called it equanimity, the quality of mind that accepts what cannot be changed without losing its steadiness. Not indifference, not numbness. a particular kind of steadiness that was compatible with genuine feeling and incompatible with the kind of suffering that comes from demanding that reality be different than it is. Hesse arrived at his version of this through the particular route of his life: the searching, the breakdown, the river, the garden, the decades. It was not the Stoic route, it was the Hesse route. He was the only person who could have taken it. This is what was discovered in the middle of the breakdown, the thing he encoded in Siddhartha and Steppenwolf and the Glass Bead Game. Without ever quite naming it directly, the striving is not the problem. What the striving wants is the problem. It wants to arrive, and arriving is not the nature of the self, or the river, or the life. The nature of all of these things is movement. The nature of all of these things is the arriving itself. The act of arriving, which is always in process and never complete. He had run toward that in the rain at 14 and arrived at it in his 70s. It had taken 60 years. He had used every one of them. What remains when the striving stops is not nothing. This was the discovery that took Hesse 60 years to articulate, and that he articulated finally, not in prose, but in the act of sitting in his garden and watching the light on the water and not needing it to be anything other than what it was. The Gita says that the fruit of action is not your concern, the action itself is the concern. Hesse had spent his whole life acting, writing, searching, building a self out of the materials available. And the fruit had been this: the capacity to sit without needing the sitting to produce anything. The action had led to the non-action. The striving had led to the end of striving, not as a failure, but as a fulfillment. This was what the river had always been saying. He had finally learned to hear it. The darkness of the room is complete. The breath is moving. The night is holding everything. Chapter 31, The Ferryman, at the end. Vasudeva ferries Siddhartha across the river for the last time. He is old. Siddhartha is old. They have spent decades beside the water, ferrying people across, listening to the river, not saying very much. Their lives have been, in the external sense, uneventful. They have not accumulated. They have not risen. They have simply been here, and the river has been here, and the people who needed crossing have come, and they have been taken across. Near the end of the novel, Vasudeva enters the forest. He does not explain. He walks into the trees, and Siddhartha understands, without being told, that Vasudeva has gone to die. Not dramatically. In the way that the river, at certain points, goes underground, still moving, still the same river, just no longer visible from the surface. This is the image Hesse had for death. Not the end of movement, a change in the mode of movement. He was not afraid of death, he wrote in his letters from the 1950s. He was occasionally afraid of suffering. He was sometimes troubled by the question of whether the things he had written had been worth the cost to the people who had had to live with him while he wrote them. But death itself, the going underground, the return to the river that had always been flowing, this did not frighten him. Let your breath be soft and slow. The room is very still. He had lived by his 70s long enough to understand that the self he had spent so many years trying to discover was not a fixed thing that could be found and then possessed. It was an event. It was the particular quality of awareness that arose when he sat at the desk in the early morning, or put the brush to the paper, or walked the path above the lake. It was not continuous in the way that he had imagined at 20 that the soul was continuous. It was intermittent. It came and went, and the work of the inner life was not to capture it and hold it, which was impossible, but to make the conditions under which it was more likely to come. The conditions were simple. They had always been simple. Silence, attention, the willingness to be here rather than somewhere else. The practice of not requiring the present moment to be different from what it was. Vasudeva knew this without having needed to read anything. He had learned it from the river. The river had been teaching it for longer than any text had been written. At the end of the novel, after Vasudeva has gone into the forest, Siddhartha sits alone at the river, and an old monk named Govinda, his childhood friend, the faithful one who had stayed with the Buddha, comes to the crossing and recognizes him. They are both very old. They have lived entirely different lives. Both have been honest. Both have been sincere. Both have arrived somewhere. Govinda does not understand quite where Siddhartha has arrived. He asks him to teach him. Siddhartha smiles and cannot. The teaching cannot be given. Govinda leans down and presses his lips to Siddhartha's forehead, and in that touch, in that moment of genuine contact between two old men at the end of their lives, Govinda sees everything at once. All the faces, all the forms the world has taken and will take, the river flowing through all of them. He weeps. The weeping is not grief, it is recognition. What Hesse had spent 85 years trying to write was the face in the water, the face that is everyone and no one, the face that is all times at once, the face that Govinda sees at the end and weeps at recognizing. He came closer and closer with each book, each poem, each letter. He never quite arrived, but the approaching was its own form of arriving. Each sentence was a river stone. Each book was a reach toward the ferry, and perhaps the completeness that eluded him in language was never meant to be held in language. Perhaps it was only ever meant to be felt in the silence at the end of a long night, in the breath just before sleep, in the moment when you stop trying to understand what you are and simply rest in the fact that you are here, still here, the river still moving, the face still returning to the surface of the water. The recognition does not require words. It never did. The night is generous. The breath is easy. We are near the end of the river. Chapter 32. The river does not run out. Here is the sentence. Near the end of Siddhartha, not the last line, not the famous line about the smile, but the one that comes a few pages before, quietly, in the middle of Siddhartha and Govinda's final conversation, Siddhartha says something about time. He says that time is not real. that everything that has existed exists in the same moment, that the river he is looking at now contains the river he looked at as a child and the river that will be there long after he is gone, that the suffering and the joy and the searching and the arriving are all simultaneous, all part of the same movement, none of them more real than the others. And then he says, "Therefore I love the stone, and I love the tree, and I love everything that exists, because the stone will be a spirit one day, and the spirit will be a stone one day." This is the sentence most people miss. Not because it is obscure, because it arrives when the listener is already at the edge of sleep, when the argumentative part of the mind has gone quiet enough that the sentence can land without being evaluated. It lands as something already known, not learned, recognized. Feel the breath. The room is around you. Let the darkness be complete. The river does not run out. This is the lesson of Vasudeva's life and Siddhartha's, and by the end of it, Hesse's. The river does not run out because it is not going anywhere. It is the same river everywhere it is, in all the forms it takes: rain, cloud, stream, lake, ocean, rain again. The stone in the riverbed is water slowed to its hardest form. The spirit that watches the river is water at its most translucent. Everything is the same river. Hesse understood this intellectually by his 40s. He understood it in his body by his 60s, by his 80s. He simply was it, the way Vasudeva was it, without needing the concept. The loop he left open in the 9th chapter, the sentence near the end of Siddhartha, resolves here. The sentence is not about time, finally. It is about the nature of the thing doing the searching. The searcher is not a separate thing that moves through the world collecting experiences. The searcher is the same substance as what it is searching through. The river is not something Siddhartha is looking at. The river is what Siddhartha is, moving in a particular form, in this particular moment. You are not looking at the dark room. You are the dark room, and the breath moving through it and the night around it, all the same substance at different temperatures. This does not need to be believed. It only needs to be heard. At the edge of sleep, it often is. Govinda kissed the old man's forehead and wept without knowing why. The river does not run out. There is a quality of experience that arrives sometimes in the last minutes before sleep. Not a thought, not exactly, but something that thinks itself through you rather than the other way around. A recognition. A momentary alignment between the self that is watching the mind and the mind being watched, in which both become briefly transparent, and what remains is awareness itself, clean and unremarkable and entirely sufficient. Hesse spent 50 years trying to describe this in prose. He never quite succeeded. Vasudeva does not describe it either. The description cannot be adequate. It can only indicate the way a finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, but if you follow the direction of the finger, the moon is there. The river does not run out because it is not made of the same water. This was a fact Hesse returned to repeatedly in the later years, marveling at the paradox of it. The river you stand beside today is not the river you stood beside 10 years ago. Every molecule of water has been replaced many times. And yet, the river is the river. The continuity is not in the content, but in the pattern, the form, the direction, the willingness to flow. This, he thought, was also what a person was. Not a collection of fixed contents, but a direction. Not a thing that possessed identity, but a pattern that enacted it endlessly through the changing materials of a changing life. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago. And yet, here you are, the river that you are, still flowing, still recognizably yourself. Your breath is slow, the room is dark, the pointing is finished. Chapter 33. Coming home to what was always there. The room in Montanola. Return to the beginning, the desk, the lamp, the lake below. The man who has been writing for 60 years without stopping, without arriving, without giving up the search. He is not searching now, exactly. He is attending. The quality of his attention to the page is the same quality of attention he has spent 40 years practicing in the garden and at the painting table. The presence, the willingness to see what is actually here rather than what should be here. What is here is the page and the night and the olive trees beyond the window and the lake below the hill and the breath moving through the body of a man who has been carrying a question for most of a century. The question is still here. It has not left, but it sits differently now. It sits the way the stone sits in the river, held, unhurried, exactly where it is. This is what coming home means for a person who spent their early life running toward unnamed things. Not the discovery of the destination, the recognition that the traveling itself was the home. The question was the home. The searching was what it was like to be this particular self, alive in this particular body, in this particular time. Let your body settle into the last stages of the night. The shoulders are soft, the jaw is soft, the breath is moving on its own. He had left Cal. He had climbed the seminary wall. He had run from the institutions that could not hold him, from the marriages that could not contain him, from the literary world that wanted him to be one thing when he was always several things at once. He had run until he arrived in Montanola, and in Montanola he had stayed. He had arrived in the place that was his own, and he had found, in the arriving, that the thing he had been running toward had been present at every stage of the running, in the field, in the rain, at 14, in the bookshop in Basel at 19, in the basement room in Lausanne at 40, in the Montagnola garden at 50, 60, 70, 80. It had always been present. The search had been the search for the experience of a presence that was already there. This is the thing Hesse could not say in a single sentence or a single book, and so he said it across a lifetime of sentences and books, said it in the river and in Vasudeva's silence, and in Harry Haller's terrible honesty, and in the old monk Govinda's weeping at the end. You were not searching for something missing. You were searching for something that was never gone. The lamp is on in the small room on the hill. The night is soft outside. The lake is below, invisible in the dark. But there, It has always been there. The river is always moving. Let your eyes close if they have not closed already. Let the weight of the night settle over you completely. You are home. Chapter 34, The Last Watercolor. He painted until he was 85. His hands were not what they had been. The wire-rimmed spectacles had grown thicker over the years, and he held the brush with the particular, careful tenderness of a person who knows that the act of doing something has become precious precisely because it cannot last much longer. The last paintings are not the best technically. They have the quality of imprecision that age brings to the hand, the line that is not quite where the eye intended. But they have something the early paintings did not. A quality of acceptance in the color, a willingness to let the mark be what it is rather than what it was planned to be. He painted the olive trees above the lake, the same trees he had painted for 40 years. They were different trees now, or he was different, which amounts to the same thing. The light on them in the October mornings of his 84th year was a light he had never seen before, even though he had looked at it on this hillside for 4 decades. He had learned to look. This was the thing he most wanted to say to the strangers who wrote him letters. Not the philosophy, not the Jungian framework, or the Buddhist concepts, or the Vedantic unity of things. The practice. You learn to look. You practice looking at the thing that is actually here, again and again, until the thing that is here reveals itself as inexhaustibly new, inexhaustibly present, inexhaustibly worth the looking. The sentences are getting shorter now. Let them be short. The brush on the paper, the lake below, the light. He did not need anything else. Let your breathing slow. Let the sentence come. The night is almost complete. The last watercolor was of the garden below the house. A small painting, the plants in their late summer arrangement, the path that he had walked 10,000 times. The light that was, for him, the light of this particular morning and no other. He put down the brush. He sat in the chair by the window. The olive trees were outside. The lake was below. He had spent more than 40 years looking at them, and they were not finished. The looking was not finished. The looking would never be finished. The looking itself was the point. He understood this. He had always understood this. He had spent a lifetime learning to understand what he had always understood. This is what it means to come home. Rest now. The brush is down. The light is good. The morning is here, and it is inexhaustibly new. Chapter 35. What you were looking for. The night is at its deepest point. This is the hour when the mind has released most of what it has been carrying. The thinking has slowed. The breath has settled into its own rhythm. The room is nothing but darkness, and the weight of the blanket and the sound of whatever silence sounds like in this particular place. Hesse died in his sleep. The 9th of August, 1962. He was 85 years old. He had gone to bed in the house in Montagnola, the house he had lived in for decades, and in the night he moved from the sleep that is rest to the sleep that is something else. He was not afraid. This is the testimony of Ninon, who had known him for decades, and who sat beside him in his last months, and who said, simply, he was not afraid. He had made his peace with the river a long time ago. The going underground, the change in the mode of movement. He had been thinking about this since Siddhartha, since the river, since Vasudeva walked into the forest. He had lived long enough to know that what he was looking for had always been present, and that the looking itself had been the gift. You were not searching for something missing. You were searching for something that was never gone. That sentence belongs to no thinker. It is not attributed. It is what the searching itself teaches, when the searching is honest and long enough. You have been searching in your own way. The path you have taken is not the path in the books. It could not be. The path in the books was Hesse's path, which was no one else's. But the quality of the searching is recognizable. The feeling at the edge of sleep that something is not yet resolved, something is still being asked, something is almost but not quite at rest. That feeling is not a failure. It is evidence of life, of a consciousness alive enough to know that it does not have the complete answer yet. The complete answer is not available. This is not bad news. This is the news that the river has been delivering since there were rivers. The river is always moving. The arriving is the content, not the destination. Let the breath move. Let the night do its work. You have been carried this far by everything you have been through, the searches that did not resolve, the years that felt like wrong turns, the relationships that taught you things you did not ask to learn, the losses, the recoveries, the ordinary mornings. All of it was the river. All of it was moving in the same direction, towards the quality of stillness that is available right now, in this room, in the dark, in the breath that is moving without your help. The lamp is still on in Montagnola, or something like it. The light that was his is in the books he left, in the letters, in the understanding that one person's long and honest search can accompany another person's reek, can reach them at the edge of sleep and say, "You are not the only one who is still looking." The looking is the right thing to be doing. Rest now. Chapter 36. The sound the river makes at night. The river does not need you to listen. It makes its sound whether you hear it or not. But when you are very still, when the thinking has gone quiet and the body is heavy and the night has settled over everything with its particular completeness, you can hear it. Not a literal river unless there is one near you. The sound that the river is a metaphor for. The continuous movement of things. The world persisting. The breath moving. The dark holding. Hesse heard it for the last time on the 9th of August, 1962, in a room above a lake in Switzerland. He was 85. He had been listening for it since he was a boy beside the Nagold River in Cal, not knowing yet what he was hearing. He spent his life getting quieter so that he could hear it more clearly. By the end, he could hear it always. The sentences are shorter now. Let your eyes rest. The lake is there, below the hill. The olive trees are there, in the dark. The garden is there, the paths worn by 40 years of the same footsteps. The watercolors are on the wall. The breath is moving. There is nothing to search for tonight. The search is resting. The question is resting. You are resting in the question, and the question is not hurrying, and the night is long enough for all of it. You have been here before, not in this room, not in this darkness, but in this quality of stillness, at the edge of things, at the place where the thinking releases and something older takes over, something that does not need to search because it has never been lost. The river is always there. It does not run out. It does not need you to find it. It only needs you to be here, which you already are. The lamp is going out. The lake is below. The olive trees are still. Sleep now.